искал да ви кажа, че днешната среща се организира в хибриден формат, така че не сме само тези в залата. Имаме 90 души онлайн, а пък в залата има 57 участници. А, така че се надявам на една интересна дискусия, защото има какво да ви кажем днес. Преди да започна обаче, бих искал да изкажа своите благодарности към Техническия университет. Благодаря за гостоприемството. Благодаря, че ни осигурихте възможност да проведем събитието в тази прекрасна зала, Тех Арена, която е частично обновена по линия на оперативна програма Наука и образование за интелигентен растеж, частично със собствено финансиране от Технически университет София. А, Сградата, доколкото знам, постига пълна енергийна ефективност и има нулево потребление на енергия, тъй като е вързана с соларни панели и реално в момента така не натоварваме бюджета на Техническия университет. И за нас е много голямо удоволствие, че вече преминахме от фаза на отношения с Технически университет, и надявам се с всички висши училища в страната и научни центрове, не на управляващ орган, който следи, контролира и налага финансови корекции, бенефициент, който се отчита, а като партньори, които развиват съвместни инициативи, насочени към развитие на науката и висшето образование в страната. Целта на днешната среща, както ви информирахме, преди е да ви представим екипа на Jaspers и контролния лист за оценка на логическите матрици, който те разработиха. Какво е Jaspers? Това е служба към Европейска инвестиционна банка, която предлага техническа помощ осигурена от Европейската комисия, т.е. за България в случая е безплатна, плаща се от Европейската комисия, която подпомага страните членки в подготовката и понякога и реализацията на проекти. В миналото Jaspers основно работеше по големите инвестиционни проекти. Те имат дълга история на сътрудничество с България по отношение на проектите в областта на околната среда и водите, в Министерството на регионалното развитие и благоустройството, а в последно време обаче разшириха и полето си на действие в областта на научните изследвания и може би за пръв път по отношение на висшите училища, като те ви познават добре, защото те вече изпълниха една такава услуга за нас, като проведоха оценка на бизнес плановете и програмите за развитие на центровете за върхови постижения и центровете за компетентност, които финансираме по програмата за научни изследвания, иновации и дигитализация за интелигентна трансформация. Сега се надявам и на успешното ни сътрудничество по отношение оценката на логическите матрици на проектите на висшите училища по тази нова процедура. Колегите от Jaspers така разгледаха много внимателно, подробно насоките за кандидатстване, опитът ни от предишната процедура по предходната оперативна програма Модернизация на висшите училища едно, оценката, която извърши Организацията за икономическо сътрудничество и развитие ОИСР по отношение на предходната процедура, препоръките, които ни дадоха и които ние отразихме в настоящата и подготвиха контролен лист за оценка на тези матрици, който ще ви бъде представен днес, за да може да ви подпомогне финализиране на работата по логическите матрици. Това, което ще видите, на което искам и аз да отбележа, че за нас е много важно, предвид, че тук предоставяме директно а, финансирането, т.е. всички вие сте конкретни бенефициенти и реално сте избрани да получите тези до 2 милиона и половина евро на проект. И ние не можем да си позволим обаче да ги предоставим на проекти, които не са качествени. Затова много ще държим всеки един проект, базиран на логическа матрица, да има поне един минимум качество. Качество, което се основава първо логическата матрица да е вътрешно добре съгласувана и външно добре съгласувана, т.е. да е насочена към реални цели, свързани с рейтинговата система или стратегията за висше образование или стратегията за интелигентна специализация, вътрешно да има консистентност или съгласуваност между отделните части на логическата матрица, т.е. нуждите да обосновават целта, а дейностите да превеждат от нуждите да водят към реализиране на целта и постигането на конкретни резултати. Нуждите да са базирани на адекватен анализ, базиран на доказателства, посочване на статистика или други данни, на които стъпвате. Партньорствата да не са фиктивни и формални и да целят просто разпределяне на ресурса между две или три организации, а да са жизнени, устойчиви, да има реално участие на партньорите в изпълнение на дейностите, резултатите да са реалистични, постижими. План графикът да не бъде това, което аз често виждам в проектите, една дейност, която започва първия месец и без прекъсване продължава до последния и казваме, ето това ни е план графика, пък каквото стане там, ще видиме. Ами план графикът да съдържа конкретни етапни цели, които да ни позволят не само верифициране на искания за плащане, ами истински мониторинг на изпълнението на проекта. Там, където има рискове, да може да ги обсъдиме заедно и да ги преодолеем заедно. И не на последно място, реалистичен бюджет. Малко искам да ви кажа за подхода на оценка какъв ще бъде. Ние очакваме около 39 проекта, защото това са приоритетните професионални направления. Очакваме по един проект за всяко професионално направление, като за всеки един проект ние ще сформираме една оценителна комисия за цялата процедура, но всеки един проект ще бъде разглеждан в отделна оценителна сесия. Това означава, че когато по този проект няма забележки, ще се пристъпи към сключване на договори. Тоест, може оценителната комисия да работи 9 месеца и една година, но тези проекти, които са готови, за тях ще сключим договор, ще останат тези, които не си отразяват коментарите. Например, може да приключи по-рано за всички. Зависи както от нас, така и от вас. В оценителната комисия ще участват експерти на управляващия орган, като оценители с право на глас. Те ще взимат решенията, съответно по отделни казуси, които се виждат в оценката, но и дали да бъде или не финансиран даден проект. А експертите на Jaspers ще участват като помощник-оценители, които предоставят становище единствено по отношение на логическите матрици. Тоест тяхната роля е единствено да разгледат, оценят логическите матрици, като тяхната задача се ограничава до два прегледа на логическа матрица, т.е. един преглед, попълват контролен лист с съответните коментари. После по-подробно колегите ще ви представят подхода си за оценка, но за всеки критерий сме формулирали три нива на оценка, т.е. зелено, жълто, червено. Там, където има червени елементи, ще се иска допълване или разяснение. представяте отговор, Jaspers гледат втори път и това е финалното им решение. Тоест след това или отразявате това финално решение, или ние отхвърляме проекта, въпреки че сте директни бенефициенти. Естествено, че можете да представите аргументи, нали? Може нещо да не сме видяли. В никакъв случай не казвам да се съгласите с всичко, но казвам да отразите. Отразявате, като взимате предвид коментарите, давате необходимото обяснение и подобрявате в тази част, която считаме заедно с Jaspers, че е слаба по отношение на логическата матрица. А, може би сте забелязали, че миналата седмица направихме промени в насоките за кандидатстване. Предполагам, че всички сте ги видяли. А, едното е техническо и е свързано с актуализирани ставки по Еразъм, мисля. Така че това е общо взето във ваша полза, защото дигнахме ставките, така че да може да работите с актуални ставки, а не след това да променяме проектите. А другото е много съществена промяна и удължихме изпълнението с една година. Това е супер, мисля, че за всички. Това е благодарение на едно изменение на самата оперативна програма, което договорихме с Европейската комисия и благодарение на което ни се увеличи целият програмен период. Той беше преди до 2029 година, сега е до 2030 и ние а, решихме, че може да ви позволим да се възползвате от тази генерална промяна в продължителността на програмния период. А, и остава един друг крайен срок, който мисля, че ви притеснява, поне аз в разговори с някои от вас съм го установил. 21 април, крайен срок за подаване на проектните предложения. Това са 3 седмици от днес, като си имаме предвид, че 2 от тези 3 седмици са преди и след Великден там, непълни, които обикновено си сливаме, за да излезем отпуск. Така че имам готовност да обсъдиме евентуално още едно удължаване на срока за кандидатстване, защото за нас като управляващ орган е важно да получим качествени проекти и да намалим времето за оценка, а не да получим некачествени проекти и да компенсираме след това с по-дълъг срок на оценка. Така че ще искам все пак да чуя, да видя обратна връзка и от ваша страна относно една такава идея. Не, че ние не сме заинтересовани всичко да се случи бързо, да имаме добро финансово изпълнение, но понякога е добре да отделим повече внимание на подготовката. Мисля, че това е всичко, което исках да ви кажа в началото. Това, което сме предвидели по дневен ред. Първа точка – представяне на добри практики за модернизация във висшето образование в Ирландия. Ще ги представи господин доктор Майкъл Тобин. Той ни представи вече на нас от управляващия орган едно кратко резюме и ние бяхме изненадани да видим колко прилики има между нашата процедура и това, което правят в Ирландия, въпреки че ние не сме в никакъв случай се позовавали на ирландски опит. Втората точка е представяне на контролния лист за оценка. След това ще излезем кафе пауза, за да осмислиме това, което ни е представено. И след кафе паузата ще има дискусия, вече всички ваши въпроси, притеснения. Включително ще се опитаме да обобщим въпросите, които получаваме онлайн. Онлайн няма да даваме възможност да се включват колегите така, говорейки, ами по-скоро в чата могат да задават въпроси, които моите колеги, които седят в дясно от мен на тези червени диванчета, ще се опитат да обобщат и да представим някакво резюме, така че да не се оттекчаваме взаимно с четене и отговаряне на всеки един въпрос. И предвидели сме и кратък такъв обяд, лек, на края на днешното събитие. Ами сега бих искал да дам думата на господин Майкъл Тобин за неговата презентация. Заповядайте.
Okay, thank you. Can you all hear me? Yeah, perfect. Okay, good morning. Can take this off. My name is Michael Tobin, and I'm delighted to be here this morning. So hopefully what I will demonstrate and show you today is that there are commonalities between a project that I was involved in the Irish context. And I think then the second session, we're going to look at the high level evaluation log framework that we're going to use to make that decision. And then on our third session, we're going to look at the granular, the types of activities we'd expect to see within each of the log frame areas. So to start off, slower, okay. This is easier. To start off, what I want to talk to you about is the Irish higher education. And just to give you an example of a project that we had in Ireland back in 2019. This project had various objectives. And the objectives were that we would, as a higher education system, we would look at improving and developing a strong talent pipeline of our graduates. We said we would look at the idea of how could we organize our higher education universities to increase their internationalization profile? How could we improve our research and development, and in particular, our innovation and agility? We looked at the idea of widening participation, access, and equality of improvement. And we also wanted to get an improved quality around our teaching and learning, our pedagogy, and our methods of actually engaging and supporting the students. And that was the context where higher education was going. This all aligned with our higher education strategy of 2025. So what we saw was, based on the evidence, and the evidence coming from our various higher education policies out there on sustainability, employers, government, but also our engagement with employers, with industry, and with regional skill forums. The Irish authority, using the various policy documents, identified a project known as the Human Capital Initiative. And this Human Capital Initiative had 4 key objectives. The objectives being 1, increase the areas of identified skill needs for enterprise. And you'll see later on how that marries with the modernization of higher education to call. 2 was to future-proof our graduates with industry. Again, you can see synergies. 3 was to promote and embed transversal, competence-based skills within the actual programs. And 4 was to incentivize continued reform of our systems. Because a key metric in this project is the sustainability. It's about how can we take the lessons we learn as we go through this project for the next 3 or 4 years and bring that into the future within our organizations. There were key actions identified. The actions primarily looking at innovation, looking at priority needs for the economy, foresight, and our future. There was actions around digitalization and how do we incorporate digital skills in our learning and teaching methodologies. There were actions around how can we strengthen our relationships with industry and how can we sustain those relationships. So, to give you a context, when we look at the Irish qualifications framework, we see that the master's level and the degree levels on our systems are level 7 to 8 and level 9. And when you bring those to the Bulgarian system, it's level 6 and level 7. So in some of my slides, you might see reference to 8 and 9. They are levels 6 and 7 from a Bulgarian perspective. But we had a similar ambition. And our ambition was to focus on bachelor's and postgraduate qualifications. So what and how did this occur? Firstly, we had Pillar 1. Pillar 1's objective was to focus on graduate conversions. How can we take existing graduates and reskill them to make them ready and available for the current needs of our workforce? Pillar 2 focused on existing programs. How can we re-innovate existing programs to increase student demand and increase the number of students attending and taking those programs? And Pillar 3 focused on innovation and agility. How can we, as higher education institutions, incorporate innovation, flexibility, and agility within our faculties, within our administrative systems? Because we talk about this, and we mentioned briefly this morning about innovation from a business perspective. But we, within higher education, need to bring that agility and that innovation into our work practices as well. So they were the 3 core themes, and they were based on 3 pillars. And briefly, I'm going to go through each pillar to give you a small insight into some of the projects that evolved. Pillar 1, I've mentioned, focused on graduate conversion programs. And when we talk about graduate conversion programs, they reference to level 6 now and level 7 of the Bulgarian system. And what it actually asked to do was we were asked to marry those programs to the various ISCAs: environmental science, engineering, construction, because we were given from our policy and our evidence that these were the areas where Ireland required future skills in. So our job was to identify those relevant programs. Our targets, and the language I'm using, you will see will be relevant to your log frame later on. Our targets were people who were returning to education, those in receipt of welfare and unemployment, those people self-employed, people in work, right? They were all representing our target markets. So what was the specifics? Very similar to your specifics. You requested short courses, undergraduate, postgraduate, bachelor degrees, postgraduate degrees. We were given specifics, which was very much 1 year and 18-month programs. We were given the idea to include a dedicated work placement, or indeed every course had to be redesigned, also to include a dedicated job readiness component. How can we ensure that our students and our learners are match fit, that they're ready for when they go into the actual workplace? We also were looked at the idea of what the credits would be. So our credits were 60 credits for a postgraduate diploma, ECTS, and 30 credits for the actual dissertation. But that involved a redesign across the organization. And the key aspect also was the programs had to be new. They had to be in new discipline areas. So the evaluation stage. The first stage was evaluation whether we were eligible. That's not relevant because you've all been invited to this call. But the second stage was based on the evaluation criteria. And it's that evaluation criteria that we're going to look at in session 2 and session 3 of today. When we look at the evaluation criteria that was used in the Irish context, the first one was alignment with skills needs. And notice there, and you'll see this language throughout the course of today, we wanted demonstrated labour market demand. We wanted evidence. We wanted data. When you look at employer engagement and industry relevant, they wanted to see how well our employers were engaged with the process. We looked at the idea of learning outcomes, which is all the language of academics. Assessment. How was that married with the actual program design, but also with our modular design? Who were our target learners? Had we identified the various different groups, as is mentioned in this modernization of higher education? They looked at the value for money. What was the scale? How many learners did we anticipate that we would actually impact? What were our targets? What did we perceive to be our retention rates? And of course, finally, we looked at impact. How did these learners and graduates support the industry and the economy? And then we also wanted, with the embedding of these new programs, how was that adding to the innovation, the flexibility, and the ways we as academics work together? How did we improve that system? The criteria at that granular level was broken down to a high level. And that's the same methodology we're looking at here. So, what was the output? The output was very much that by 2023, higher education had significantly increased our capacity, right, to reskill graduates, which was significant. There was 10,593 places added on 163 programs over those actual 3 years. Now, as we all know, there was COVID in between. So when COVID came, we ended up allocating another 5,000. They focused on skill shortages. But the line I have there is, it didn't just involve course delivery. It involved a structural shift where Irish higher education, and in particular the university I'm in, we started to focus on flexible and target reskilling programs. And that's the methodology we would employ today. What it achieved was large-scale reskilling. We've seen market needs being responded to. We've seen how it impacted accessibility and participation. And we can see now the Pillar 1 was a key element of this overall program. So when we talk about Pillar 1, what happened at system level? And your modernization of higher education call is also looking at the system. How are we going to compete and impact the system? We ended up with a diversified skills supply. But what was interesting is we ended up having a greater emphasis in the areas of STEM and indeed digital. At the time, I was saying to somebody yesterday, data analytics was a major force 5, 6, 7 years ago. So a number of programs ended up in the whole area of data analytics. Biopharma and med technology, another key area. A number of grad people ended up being skilled in that entire area. Cloud computing was another area people started to get reskilled in. So what you can see, if you think about 5 years ago, that those trends where people are being employed in today was where we took the changes towards creating those learners 5, 6 years ago. And that's the same kind of foresight we're looking to see with this modernization of higher education, is how can we identify where we will need those graduates in 3, 4 years' time? And that's our key. We looked at the idea of, I suppose, academic-led, but demand-led. And that causes change within our faculties. How can we get them to be more demand-led? How can we get our academics to be more conscious of what the future skills requirement might be? And how can we get them to, in many ways, reshape their programs to achieve this? All of this at system levels involves co-creating projects with industry. And if you go back to the way we mentioned co-creation, we mentioned two key components: work placement, which involves people going to work and engaging with companies such as NVIDIA and others. And the second part was, if that wasn't feasible, to have an applied practice element within the courses. So you're given the students the actual knowledge to enable them be focused and prepared to engage with work when they actually get the post. And finally, we saw the creation of flexible. And when I mean flexible, we mean online delivery and the various modes and methodologies we use from an online perspective, making use of our virtual learning classrooms, making use of our virtual learning environments, making use of the new digital technologies that supports that learning, which adds to supporting the actual students. There was also monitoring in relation to this. So if you got allocated a funding program, you had to ensure that you had a 75% fill rate on all programs. And that was the higher education system, ensuring that the programs we had developed, graduates and students went into them. So I wouldn't get funding the following year if I didn't have a 75% funding this year. My funding was withdrawn. So the relevance was key. The second thing was, right, we had to monitor the number of programs that actually commenced. We had to look at the idea of, they externally reviewed us each semester through engaging with the students to ensure that we had live bodies and that they were actually engaging with the course and that they were positively disposed towards the course. We had to engage continuously with industry. So you've probably heard the terms industry advisory boards within your various faculties. We also created regional skills forums within our various faculties and our universities and held regular meetings, quarterly meetings, where we demonstrated there was engagement. We looked at the idea of retention. What were our retention rates? And we were all aspiring to get 80% of a retention rate on every course that commenced. And finally, we spoke about progression. Where did the students go to afterwards? And this was a key criteria. We had to demonstrate that there was a progression opportunity available for learners to go afterwards, so that they could do their postgraduate diploma or they could do their bachelor's degrees, but we clearly mapped out for them what their future path would be, were they to stay in education, either on a full-time basis or indeed on a part-time basis. So what happened within the faculty that I work in? Well, the first thing was, based on this funding, we looked at how did we design our programs. And university-wide, in the organization that I work in, as deans, the deans came together across all the disciplines, and we looked at designing new postgraduate programs and master's programs where we could design modules, where we could actually pick individual modules from one faculty, put them into my faculty's portfolio, and vice versa. That was the first thing we did. The second thing is, we worked across those faculties and we developed a common model for all of our postgraduate programs. 60 credits for a thought program, plus 30 credits, then you add it on for your research dissertation. Gives you 90 credits, and that gave you your actual master's. We focused, I suppose, on the idea of how we could be successful across all our faculties. How could we engage with the marketing? How could we engage with the administration? How could we realize the various synergies together with those central administrative bodies, as opposed to us all having various touch points. So we brought the whole together with the programs, and we identified that if we work together, we could have many different programs. Now, in my own faculty, I took a Master's of Business Administration, the MBA, and I was looking at the funding, and I said, how could I make this MBA more accessible and for more learners? So we took the year one of the MBA and we made that into a postgraduate diploma. So now we had created a 1-year postgraduate diploma in executive management that the students could take. And if they so chose, they could go off and work for 4 or 5 years. But the progression is they can come back in later on, do year 2, and then they've got a Master's of Business Administration. So we looked at designing flexibility into some of our existing postgraduate programs. When we looked at other areas, quality, I looked at the idea of quality and supply chain management. And we had a high biopharma medtech industry, particularly in the area I was in. So we looked at creating a master's in the whole area of quality, supporting the medtech, fully supported by the various medtech and biopharma companies. We looked at financial management, which was a key skill we felt all managers would want. And we also looked at the idea of innovation and design, and in particular around product design. So what we saw was that through the Pillar 1, it caused significant change across the university. You can see that through Pillar 1, it had to be evidence-based. You had to define your targets. You had to understand your activities. You had to work across universities and the academic departments, bringing in interdisciplinary impact. So Pillar 1, from our perspective, had a strong impact. For the remainder, Pillar 2, not really relevant. I'm going to spend 2 minutes on it. Pillar 2 really focused on existing courses. That's what it looked at. It focused on giving additional places. So with that, the concept behind Pillar 2 was really, how can we increase greater capacity to take students in to our actual existing programs? Because at times we find that there's a great demand for our programs, but we don't have the places for those programs. So the question mark we had was, how can we increase that capacity? So of course, again, all the respective faculties looked at that and they focused at their undergraduate level. So again, you had the various Thanks, Steve. So again, you had the various different ISCA codes. So you can see the importance of tying our new bachelor's degrees and postgraduate degrees and short courses to the various skills we've given you. I've left this slide there to give you an idea of the granular detail. So when you look at your log frames, we would like later on to see institutional capacity, institutional strategies to deliver, the opportunities for employment and for employer graduates. We would like to see durations of the course. Is it a new course? We want to understand this element of granularity. And when they looked at the actual evaluation, you can see it was very similar to the overall evaluation of Pillar 1. Capacity, demand, value for money. But this one, which I think is hugely important, is this impact of the graduate output. What impact will these graduates have on our sector? That's your criteria set up. And this gives you an idea of what it actually delivered. We increased computing IT graduates, engineering graduates, robotics, automation graduates. We increased STEM and other fields. all, as you can imagine, at that time, delivering graduates and work-ready graduates to and for the employers. We got the funding, right? And we can see that this funding at a system level enabled the entire system have a greater number of graduates ready and available. And from an industry perspective, we actually saw at that time, Ireland was in full employment and there was a ready demand for our graduates. And one of the issues we did come up with was when they went out in year 3 for work placement, a lot of the employers didn't want to let them back in to do the year 4 of their honours degree. So the employers came to us asking us about greater flexibility for how they would get their final year, whether that could be done in a part-time, in blocks, and how could we support them. And it's that flexibility again, which enables the actual deans to work together. I just put this in there for outcomes, because the key for this is you don't always win. So with any application, I think it's important to realize that we do a lot of work for these applications. And as we do a lot of the work for the applications, not everything we actually put into the application is accepted by the actual evaluators. So we won in our university 76 additional places each year. But what was interesting, there was a number of disappointed deans who had developed all of these other programs in this same idea with the additional places, but they didn't win. We've continued this idea in Ireland, and every 3 years, we actually have a new call known as a springboard call. And this is a new call which is about taking Pillar 1 and extending Pillar 1. So it's now become a way of working across the Irish higher education system. Indeed, as I was coming out here last week, on the Friday the 13th, we had a new call around micro-credentials. So next week, I go back and we implement, and I actually respond to a new call on micro-credentials around the very similar type ideas as this. And finally, innovation and agility. And when we talk about innovation and agility, what the call was looking for was innovation around how we can promote and become better at our teaching and learning methodologies. We've all seen that our learner has changed in recent years. Their engagement with us in a classroom has changed in recent years. So the question we were asking is, how can we support our academics and train our academics to be more innovative in their teaching style, in their delivery, and how can they use new methodologies? For example, we go from the traditional lecturing format potentially to a team-based learning format. Or we go from a traditional lecturing format to a flipped classroom format. Or we go from a traditional lecturing format where we actually engage more online, digital learning experiences. So how do we ensure that gray-haired academics like me can actually change our delivery methodology and style, and how is this embedded into the actual system? We set about projects around how can we create that innovation. So some of the ideas that were given at that time were the development of distance and flexible learning modalities. My entire faculty has moved from a face-to-face teaching methodology to 100% online delivery. I have no students now coming in to the university to see me. I focus exclusively on the adult learner, that mature learner over 23. But we've had to develop technologies, systems, support systems, academic learning, training methodologies to ensure that I continue with an actual retention rate of 75 to 80%. And in fact, we're actually doing better than that. But that's because you've got to look at the totality of the actual system. They looked at the idea of design thinking and STEAM. How do we look at giving credits to transversal skills, competence-based skills? How do we assess the competence-based skills? How do we ensure that the student or the learner has that ability to do the task we want them to do? And how do we marry that with the theory? So there was a lot of different innovative ideas, but that involved the academics owning this space. It involves supporting the academics to deliver on this change. The agility looked at the idea of the institutions. How can we as institutions be more flexible and more responsive to the actual learners and indeed to industry? So again, you can see that all of the higher education universities in Ireland embraced this concept. They embraced it, right? But their idea was that, you know, we needed to look at the students and give them the skills which were out there and future oriented. And how can we annually, maybe every 3 years, review what we do to ensure we meet that? Now, they looked at the idea of entrepreneurship, embedding it in science courses. You saw earlier on, I had a postgraduate diploma in engineering management, giving engineers the skills on how to manage and how to be effective leaders in their organizations. We looked at the idea of artificial intelligence and AI and how we included that in science and engineering. And in latter years, I think it's quite interesting, we're now including AI in all our business modules. So every program has now got AI, but that involves re-educating and reskilling and upskilling your actual academics, right, so that they can deliver and use this to the advantage of the actual learner. Again, the bottom line was it had impact. That is robust evidence, right, demonstrating innovation scale. And that's the terminology you're going to see us refer to when we look at our log frame later on. So we want a strategic alignment. We wanted your ambitions and your objectives to be aligned to the evidence base. We wanted innovation and transformation. We wanted to see this, and the Irish HEA wanted to see this. We wanted to understand the partnerships and the depth and the detail of the partnerships. They wanted to understand the scale and the reach of the output. And finally, governance. What was the management? How was this governance sustainable into the future? How are we managing this change within our actual organizations? Again, did a very simple overarching evaluation table where they gave us some brief feedback on that. But what did this do? This ended up funding 24 large projects. It engaged 20,000 learners, right? And it created new levels of flexible, industry-aligned education. And it did drive system-wide innovation. And there's an example of all the 24 projects. And on the top right-hand corner here, I've given you the link and you'll get this PowerPoint presentation that you can click on the link and you can go in and see what each one of those projects involved. So on that website, you'll see there's a piece looking at micro-credentials. 7 universities came together, and together they developed a micro-credential identity for the 7 universities. They created a new application, website, collaborative process, partnerships, where now if you go to Ireland and you look at microcreds.ie, you will see all of the universities advertising their programs together, yet the learner will get the learning from each individual institution. One example, we see from a construction and a building environment, we looked at how can we make our construction more sustainable. The use and the methodologies we employ, how can we make them more sustainable? Because that's what we need to meet all of the ESG goals, including European policy goals. So a project was created with looking at DASB. And what that involved was taking all the existing programs in that space, again, across 4 different universities, working together, identifying what was relevant, and then all of them redesigning their programs and their modules to incorporate sustainability so that the graduate and the student has these skills when he or she hits that workplace. There was one where they looked at, UL and others looked at the idea of a professional master's. So they looked at the whole concept of work-based learning. How can we accredit and give somebody a master's to the methodology known as work-based learning? How can we validate that work that they're doing and accredit it as an actual level 9 postgraduate qualification? So again, they came, they stress tested, they reviewed it, and they delivered. And finally, they looked at and this is the 4th one I'm looking at, they looked at the idea of re-engaging. How can we continually scan for what the future skills are needed? How do we ensure we've got industry, we've got technology, innovation, future thinking as to where we're going, right? And how can we always be, I use the term match fit and match ready. The links for those and all 24 are on that website, and it's with the Irish Higher Education Authority. So it did have system level impact. It did assist to transform the Irish higher education system. The outcomes, there was over 84 partnerships created across the Irish 23 higher education institutions. There was 23,000 learners impacted, right? There was 4,200 additional students. There was 34 disciplines impacted across all of this change. So when you look at that, the relevance that a call like the modernization of higher education and its impact on Bulgaria and your higher education system can be quite significant. So it's important at the outset that we actually get our log frames correct, that we get our interventions correct, that we get our challenges and our targets correct, so that we can deliver some of this style of change over the next 4 years. Again, policy, policy, policy. Because when you talk about policy, policy never stops. So we have a responsibility that even though we may get funding today or next month or in September, to continually be scanning the policy so we can ensure that we've always got the evidence. So what we've seen in a European and an Irish context, we've seen many different agendas come out. So our job as academics is to continually scan the policy, continually focus. It's not like we win funding today for 4 years and now we go, let's stop. We've got to continually bring that change across our system. It was a great success. It has been a comprehensive transformation of the Irish system, right? It did deliver reskilled graduates. It did deliver traditional graduates and increases, and it did deliver system innovation. So, in my estimation, it was transformative. In my estimation, it added great value. And in my estimation, this is our opportunity here today in Bulgaria to take the concepts and ideas, which is quite interesting. They were done, our projects and your projects were mutually exclusive until I introduced it yesterday, right, to Ivan, right? But it's interesting, the impact that, and the similarities across them, right? There was guiding principles, and we talked about guiding principles. I'd ask you to demonstrate meaningful collaboration and close partnership with industry in all of your log frames. I'd ask you to demonstrate how your proposals meets the call objectives. This is at high level. I'd ask you to demonstrate institutional capacity to deliver the projects. I'd ask you to demonstrate alignment and fit with national education and the various policies. And indeed, finally, I'd say, provide evidence of the potential transformation, right? And also focus on learner design. And if they were your very high level ideas as you think conceptually about your projects, I do think we'll have success. Because this is just a graphic I received. This is our university, and we've all got a university. And whether we think of one university or 20 universities, we all more or less have the same development. But in every project, all are impacted. So it's crucial that we ensure that we're aware of all our various stakeholders so that we're all getting this, I suppose, university-wide change, which we can all sustain. Thank you.
Тук е мястото да попитам, има ли някакви въпроси, имате ли впечатление по ирландски опит, което бихте искали да изкажете, предложения? Отзад само ще помоля да се представите. Искам само да, защото пропуснах в началото да ви кажа, че правиме запис от срещата, за да може след това, видях, че в чата има въпроси за презентациите. Ще качиме към новината от днешното събитие всички презентации. Ще се опитаме да направим и видеоматериал от представянията, затова правиме и запис и ще помоля да се представите все пак, когато задавате въпроси. Заповядайте.
На български или на английски?
Има преводачи, това са нашите преводачи там. Който не се чувства комфортно, може да ползва превода, така че съвсем спокойно може на български да говорите. Господин Тобин ще слуша превода.
Тодор Илон, Стопански факултет на Софийския университет. Два въпроса. Първия е колко време е отнела тази трансформация, за която говорихте. И в частност прехода към изцяло онлайн обучение. И второ, какви са регулациите за micro-credentials и колко време е отнело справянето с регулацията. Задавам този въпрос, защото от години, поне от 4 години, се чудим как да въведем micro-credentials в рамките на международните мрежи, акредитирани по икономика, с които участваме и не можем да намерим начин как да се справим с българската регулация. Ако има такава възможност с модернизация 2.0 това да се случи, смятам, че България ще има много големи успехи, включително в региона. Благодаря ви.
Okay. Okay. I've taken that as two questions, right? The first question was, how long did it take to go from online or from face to online? I started originally dabbling in online back in 2016, 2017 through a system known as Adobe Connect. I don't know if you ever came across Adobe Connect. So what I did was initially I would have started off with one program and I would have piloted and tested that one program. And that kind of went on to 2 and 3 programs up to 2020. But COVID was a massive change factor for us. With COVID, I was enabled to put everything, because I had no choice, to put everything onto online. And there was 2 things with that. Online one was around my academics, and initially I had resistance to engaging with the online world, because you can imagine new technologies, new ideas. Guys are working and women are working 25, 30 years, and now we want them to use technology. But COVID was the greatest shift in that. So they all had to engage. So that was the first win. But the second win was the learner, because the learner at times had disengaged from online as well. They saw it as not necessary, can't do it, won't enjoy it, etc. But COVID was another catalyst for me in relation to that. So when you asked the question, how long? I was very fortunate because COVID has enabled us move into this flexible space. And the online world never stops because the online world is now changing and how we deliver to our students is now changing. My virtual learning classroom now is Zoom. We have transcribed lectures. We have 100% recorded lectures. We make use of different modalities. We're looking at AI agents as tutors within our virtual learning environment and our Moodle. We're always stress testing what happens. So in response to your question, and I think this is what structural reform is about, it never stops. We identify the baseline and then incrementally we try to change it every single year. And I try to, I suppose, in many ways to have organizational and system change every single year. The second part of your question is micro-credentials. And you're not alone when we talk about micro-credentials. So, you know, authorities support us, but we also have our own internal university quality assurance methodologies. So even as micro-credentials has evolved, in my own university, we would have had micro-credentials initially. We'd have said anything from 0 to 10 ECTS. But with the micro-credentials project, which I highlighted earlier on, we've now got almost a national standard for micro-credentials. Micro-credentials currently in the latest call is defined from 0 to 20 ECTS. Okay, that's the first baseline. My own university would define micro-credentials as 0 to 30, right? But the call is 0 to 20, so we work with that for this call. In the design of micro-credentials, the beauty is that you can design micro-credentials very fast. I suppose, being involved in lifelong learning for many, many years, I've always had a model which was known as a special purpose award. And a special purpose award is something which would have gone from 0 to 30 ECTS. So a micro-credential is very much a relabeling of my special purpose awards to meet very much industry demand. And when we talk about micro-credentials, it comes down then to the delivery methodology. We all know with ECTS, we have so many of independent learning hours and self-directed learning hours we must deliver. So as we look at that, we then define what our delivery methodology is. It can be over 3 days, 24 hours. It can be over 2 weeks. It can be over 12 weeks by 2 hours a week. Many different modalities. So I hope that addresses your question.
И аз бих искал да добавя, че за двете теми, мисля, че напълно се покриват от допустимите дейности по тази процедура. Тоест, единият фокус е именно преминаване към онлайн обучение, възможност за дигитални курсове. А за микрокредитите, тук мисля, че има така празнота в законодателството, но си спомняте по предишната процедура драмата с съвместните дипломи. В крайна сметка, по един или друг начин се реши и законово този проблем. Така че с европейското финансиране общо взето понякога се получава така, че първо създаваме някакъв продукт, тестваме го, апробираме го и след това се създава критична маса и натиск, за да се въведе в законодателството. Така че аз бих ви посъветвал да започнете. Знаем, че НАОА работят по въпроса. Това го има и в стратегията за висше образование, така че рано или късно ще се случи. Когато има разработен модел, може и вашия да стане основа за националната политика. Други въпроси и предложения? Заповядайте. Заради преводачите. Преводачите да могат да превеждат.
Георги Райновски, Софийски университет, физически факултет. What is your personal academic field of expertise? What is your personal academic field of expertise?
No problem. Okay, so I'm actually an economist. Okay, so economics. And I would have done a lot on system change, foresight, and educational management. So that's what I would typically work in. And I've been involved in academic management change for the best part of 20 years. I'm also actively involved in new course and new program design. So, for example, I've seen recently through some work in Dubai and some work in Ireland that we've had a demand for increasing learning for our educators. So we have post-primary, primary, and higher education people. So I've looked at the idea, and we just validated last week a master's in education innovation, management, and leadership, which is a cross-sector master's focusing on, shall we say, giving teachers, principals, heads of departments in our academic institutions the skills so they can manage the institutions better. So we look at governance, structures, financial management, policy, evidence-based, along with the idea of their own management skills, because sometimes we forget to reflect on who we are and how do I manage and what's my management style and what's my leadership style and what's my negotiation style. So that's my area. I'm also, we mentioned micro-credentials in response to this call based on, I suppose, working with industry. And I have a team, we're always working with the industry, always scanning industry. And last week, 2 weeks ago, we would have validated 10 micro-credentials. One was in the area of cyber security. One was in the area of artificial intelligence and automation. One was in the area of logistics and supply chain management, and I can go on. But the reason I'm referencing these is currently in Ireland, there is a lack of knowledge among industry on AI and its benefits, on cybersecurity and its benefits. So with small 10 credit micro credentials, we're able to target that skill, deliver that skill, but give an actual credit to an individual which is stackable. And what I mean by stackable is there's a progression for that individual to go into a greater depth in some other program we have. So one of my fundamental principles in program design, when you talk about micro-credentials, is stackability. Where does the module and the program go afterwards? I hope that addresses. Yeah. Oh, I might as well say I come from an industry background. So I suppose I'm very much a managerialist when it comes to education.
Има един въпрос онлайн, който е зададен на английски, така че ще го прочета на английски. Той е към Майкъл. How the universities should identify skills shortage or labor market demand for each of the approved project areas. Should they be officially published data, national data, or it could be based on inter-university QA data analysis?
Okay. I'd probably add a third element to that. So on one hand, we have all of the published data, the national data. That's the first one. The second, we probably have regional data. But there's a third part which is crucial to this, which is partnerships. And in developing your programs, you really have to pick up the phone and talk to these industries. You've got to understand what do they actually need. You've got to inquire, right? What particular skills might they have? Most of our industries have representative bodies and representative groups. And with those representative bodies and the groups, right, you can identify what skills they might need 1 year, 12 months, 14 months, 2 years out. So if I was talking, Ivan, I would say national data, regional data from the regional agencies. But third, I think it's crucially important that industry and the university and the people outside the environment of the university, that you engage with them, not just once, but that you have a continual process. And, you know, years ago, I spoke about a concept of a university without walls. All of our universities now can't have walls. People have to be able to feel freely to be able to come in and go out.
Благодаря. Предлагам да преминете към следващата презентация, за да не губим време.
Okay, they're keeping me up here. So you have me again. Okay, so I'm with you now until coffee. Okay. What we're going to look at for the next 20 minutes or 25 minutes is I've made an effort to frame the modernization of higher education call, right? Using the same terminology that I've just demonstrated to you from an Irish higher education system. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you about the high level criteria that we're going to seek when we look at your various log frames. The session after this, we look at the granular areas, but let's just have a high level. And hopefully then you'll go for a cup of coffee. And as you have your coffee, we might have new collaborations. We might have new ideas. We might have differences and opinions coming out, which we can all work together. And maybe out of today, we'll have another collaborative joint proposal coming in, which will be very, very positive. Okay. When we look at the modernization of higher education, and I'm not going to go through the entire call because you know what the call is, right? You've all read the documentation. But if you take a look at what it's trying to achieve, its core principle is similar to the Irish context. It's about having evidence. It's about ensuring that we marry our policy with our industry stakeholders. It's about you being aware, and I have actually read these documents. It's about being aware of the National Development Plan of Bulgaria. It's about understanding the OECD report. It's about seeing what's out there in the Education and Training Monitor. And it's about mapping these and using this data and seeing the relevance and asking yourself, can we position our ideas, our short courses, our bachelor's degrees, and our postgraduates within this context? Because what we're looking for is skills relevance. We're looking for digital and green transitions, flexible provision, inclusion, and widening participation. We want that quality system, as you mentioned, with the credentials and system modernization. It always changes, but sometimes there's a kind of a lag. And of course, everything is evidence-based. So when you look at yours and you look at our system, and you saw a similar slide to this before, the key objectives are promote confidence-based education, transversal skills. Let's be impactful. Let's identify how we get those across our various programs. Second one, let's look at advanced digital transformation. How are we using digital technologies as we deliver and design these programs? What new tools are we using? International attractiveness. How do we get our students to go out? But how do we attract other students in here? How do we attract other academics to come over and maybe through Erasmus, etc., work with us, and vice versa? How do we get that input-output going from an international perspective? And how do we ensure that the programs we're delivering are relevant to those international students? And finally, interdisciplinarity. How do we ensure that we're actually working across universities and we're taking the ideas? I mean, isn't it fantastic? You could take the idea of design and innovation and creativity from an arts department and bring that into engineering, or even bring it into business. And how can we actually start to cross-fertilize our program design with different academic disciplines, benefiting the actual learner? Because sometimes we know ourselves, we are too pigeonholed within our academic domains. So how can we bring that across the system? The key that we're looking at here are your bachelor's and master's programs and short micro credentials or special purpose awards. How are we going to ensure that we change and migrate from this idea of final examination to 50% of continuous assessment? And what methodologies will we use for that? How do we mitigate against the risk of artificial intelligence with that continuous assessment? How do we support our academics in developing the rubrics to get that right? All questions you might look at. And we also look, I suppose, at the idea of tasks. And we know ourselves that ECTS is defined as independent learning hours and self-directed learning hours. How are we supporting our academics to develop more material so that the student can do more independent learning themselves, adding greater value to what they actually do? And of course, our objectives go across. We want a modernization of a new curriculum. We want lifelong flexible pathways. We want digital transformation. We want inclusion and equal access, quality, and strengthening the institutional capacity. These are all the types of activities and actions that are relevant to this call. And they're all, as I would say myself, laced in between every single log frame that you produce in relation to this call. And it will all support this system high level reform and sustainability that the management authority is seeking to address. Okay, you've seen yourselves the different types of fundings. Apply modern and flexible learning methods, additional trainings, training of lecturers, training of employees and administration of the HEAIs, mobility of students and teachers, promotion of Bulgarian higher education institutions and exchanges abroad. That's the type of activity that was recommended in your modernization of higher education. And I'm sure you've all had many coffee sessions, meetings, team groups, where you've identified 3, 4, 5 key areas where you're going to have change. Now, hopefully what you'll see today is you'll consider some of the actual outputs of that. And you'll ask yourself, I use the term stress test. You'll stress test your applications against some of this criteria to ensure that you deliver the outputs of what's required. The ESF, we know ourselves, in any application, have very strong guidelines, and you can Google that and check that out yourselves. They would like to see all of our projects alignment with EU and national priorities. There's no use having inputs without having results and outputs. So we need to be clear of what the outputs are, and we need to see the relationship with them. We want smart indicators, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. And that's what we want even for our programs, to have that smart modality and methodology employed. Monitoring, reporting, and evaluation is key, and we mentioned that briefly earlier on. Financial management and compliance. I've mentioned already, they talk about inclusion. But the one that's key for this initiative is partnerships. And you'll see later on, how do you demonstrate the validity of the partnerships? How are you managing the partnerships? Practically, I'd ask you, what terms of reference have you got with those partners? Have you agreed a memorandum of understanding with the partners? Have you agreed a memorandum of association with the partners? Have you formalized that relationship? All of these are key outputs, which we'd expect to see from your inputs. And of course, sustainability and long-term impact. Okay, so for the next 10 minutes, I'm quickly going to go through this because I can see you're all looking for coffee. For the next 10 minutes, I'm going to look at the checklist. What we have at a very high level as the evaluators, what we're looking for is we want to see the project relevance and how it's going to impact the objectives of the MHE2, Modernization of Higher Education 2. At a high level, we want to see the quality of this intervention logic. When we talk about the quality, we want to see a strength in your log frames, objectives to outputs, also recognizing and mitigating against risks, because we'd be aware of them. We'd want to see indicators, your KPIs. What's the number of programs? What's the number of learners? The number of academics? What's your target? We'd like to see risk management, and finally, impact and sustainability. And at a high level, from an evaluator perspective, we're going to determine the good, the bad, and the ugly programs, right? And call documents from this. So when we talk about RAG, red, amber, and green, unfortunately, red is the ugly, right? The bad is the amber, and the good is our green. So when we look at our summary scoring, we're going to focus on that kind of basis. We're going to take at a high level, when we sit as a team and when we try to assess this program, at a high level, we as a team are going to say, is one, project relevance modernization, is that red, amber, or green? Is program 2, is 1.2, quality of intervention, red, amber, or green? And the evaluators, by the way, will have to validate and justify this, okay? But that's the methodology we're going to have. And we will then be able to give you feedback, or indeed advice, or questions, but we might seek further clarification on each area. So, what's expected? And I'm just going to say this, I'll say it a few times, I'd say. Remember, it's not easy for the evaluators. Jump over the fence. You've got to be clear and concise in how you present your information. We're just like you. We're individuals who are now going to get a whole series of applications, and we've got to assess those applications. So your job is to make those applications clear, brief, and brilliant. Make them articulate, make them short, make them precise, put them in a methodology that I can read them and that I can understand. And remember, I don't speak Bulgarian, so this is going to have to be looked from a Bulgarian perspective, right? So you have a job to finally edit your applications, right? Before you submit them. Because from I suppose, an evaluator's perspective, I'm looking for all of these aspects, evidence-based. I'm looking for partnerships. I'm looking for clear log frames. I'm looking for the teams created in the project. But they've got to jump out to me. When you're advising students around answering assessments and assignments, etc., you've developed your program learning outcomes and you assess based on those program learning outcomes. We're assessing based on the actual call objectives, program learning outcomes, taking your language. That's what we're assessing on. So clarity is crucially important from my perspective. So let's look at a detailed discussion. What might we look at each one of these? Well, first, when it comes to project relevance, what do we want to see in project relevance and what will we be expected? We'd say to ourselves, we'd like to see alignment with national and European strategies. We'd like to see stakeholder-informed analysis. We'd like to see integration of confidence-based learning. We'd like to see clear contributions to employability. We'd like to see the idea that we're impacting higher education. And then, this is where you all go, wow. Then, what I've done is, from reading the various policy documents on your systems, what I've actually seen is some key areas which you can get information on. So, I want to see the problem linked to your HE challenges. I want to see evidence from national statistics. We want to see alignment with how you're going to improve HE quality. We want to see engagement with the priority groups. How are we going to widen participation? We want to see the idea of robust analysis, data, and stakeholder engagement. We want to see the contribution you're making to graduate employment. So on a more detailed level, this is the discussion we'll be having. We'll ask ourselves, well, is this project meeting the MHE2 objectives? Have they demonstrated widening participation? As you read it, did you get an idea around sustainability? Are we engaging proactively with our partners? And that's our high-level discussion to give us the red, amber, or green indication. Under quality, it's quite similar. But now we're focusing on the quality. Are there well-designed activities? What are they looking for? What are those interventions? What are those short courses, bachelor programs, and master's programs? What risks have they accounted? Is there an internal consistency in the way they've delivered this? And again, I've given you a whole range of areas. Is there a causal chain link? Are we looking at, shall we say, defined outcomes? I've mentioned already the partnership across the HEIs, but is there a strong coherence around those partnerships? Can we see how those partnerships are evolving? We heard this morning, Ivan extended the deadline. So do we see those milestones and those timelines represented and reflected there? Do we see the deliveries we're going to have on an annual basis? Do we see the outputs we might have? And that's the discussion at a high level the evaluators will have. When we look at indicators, how many short-term programs? How many bachelor's degrees? In what areas? What ISCID areas are we impacting? What postgraduate areas are we impacting? How, as an organization, are we going to get people to do it? Why is it relevant to the actual industry? And, you know, when we look at the indicators, we're asking, you know, what is our monitoring system? What accountability will we actually have? And again, to assist us in our discussions, we have a whole series of what we call detailed questions, detailed considerations, log frame considerations, so you can stress test what you actually give to us. Have you got credible means of verification? Have you got a data collection plan? Have you got a clear baseline? Remember, when I spoke about the Irish example, we said 75% are registration. We said 80% retention. We had to look at ways of training our academics. How many training days did we deliver? How many students went out? How many students came in? All of those are the key data. How many modules have we transformed from 100% final examination to now being 50% assessment-based? All of these factors are important. If we look at the feasibility and risk, and this is important from your perspective, have you got the institutional capacity to deliver on this? Have you got the institutional capacity, and we mentioned online learning, to develop that? Have you got, shall we say, key people and personnel identified who will take this project from A to Z? Have you allocated the capacity? Have you looked at and aligned your resources? My last slide in the last presentation looked at the totality of the university. Are the other arms of the university aware of the impact this will have on them? And have you brought them involved and engaged them in your actual transformation process? Again, we give you some questions. We look here at realistic assumptions, a realistic implementation plan. And these are the questions, by the way, that we'll ask when we sit down as a team. And we'll say to ourselves, you know, is this a credible delivery model? Given your experience, Michael, is this a credible delivery model? We'll ask that question. We'll ask the question, you know, have they completely defined the complementary roles with effective coordination mechanisms? We'll look at the idea, have they looked at human resources? And is there an allocation correctly in relation to that? And then finally, you're delighted because your tea and coffee is coming up. We look at impact and sustainability. How are you going to ensure that the change you bring about will continue within your faculties and your universities moving forward? What have you considered as the success factors for this project? What are your own internal success factors? How are you going to make sure that you actually live those success factors well into the actual future? So we're looking at credible plans for continuation. We're looking at institutional embedding. We're looking at durable outcomes, because that's the transformation we want. And again, a number of key questions. I wonder, what's your contribution in 4 years' time to internationalization? I spoke to a gentleman this morning and he was telling me that they have 1,000 international students, right, in his university. Will that be 1,500 or 2,000 in 4 years' time? What markets will be there? He mentioned his markets were very much increasing in, shall we say, the Asian markets. What markets will exist for you in those areas in years to come? You look at the idea of, I suppose, designed outputs that are designed to be reusable, transferable, and scalable. Will this methodology of 50% continuous assessment, will that become a principle of your program design in your faculties going forward? When I design programs, my programs are designed typically 6 10 ECTS modules a year. 2 modules per semester are always continuous assessment, 100%. 1 module will have a final examination, and that's it. And that's a defined principle program design model which I use. Will we see this now embedded in your structures going forward? But these are all considerations for you. You know, it's not easy. I'm going to say to you, good luck. I'm going to say, program and work packages must not just be compliant, they must be impactful. And I hope today you've got a flavor of what we're looking for: impact. We want these programs to be impactful. We want them to be measurable and to be coherent. And we want to achieve the modernization of higher education objectives. So I'm going to let you go for coffee. There is a next session, and I'm back again. All right. And what I'm going to do at the next session is we're going to go into the specifics, what we might see within each element of the actual log frame. What we'd like you to do now is to enjoy your cup of coffee, right? We'd like you to, as you're having considerations and having coffee and chatting, remember, be clear, concise, and brilliant. We're human. We're evaluators. We also have to be able to read what you send into us. So you've now got time to collaborate. You've time to chat, right? You've time to share experiences and share ideas. And I'm down for a coffee. So thank you very much.
Благодаря. Сигурен съм, че последните месеци сте вложили доста усилия, за да развиете концепциите си, да намерите подходящите партньори. Подготвили сте вече проектите на логически матрици и сега ви оставя само да ги калибрирате по тези критерии. Но нека сега да излезем в кафе пауза, след което очакваме вашите въпроси, предложения, включително по отношение на крайния срок за подаване на проектите. Заповядайте, кафето е отзад. Започваме сесията въпроси, отговори, дискусия. Като наистина ви насърчавам да сте открити, не се притеснявайте, затова сме се събрали. Сигурен съм, че доста притеснения се породиха във вас от тази детайлна матрица за оценка, която до сега не сте виждали, въпреки че обявявахме от самото начало, че ще има такава. Затова думата е ваша. Колегите ще асистират с микрофон. Моля да говорите на микрофона заради преводачите, за да могат те да превеждат. Заповядайте. Кой дигна ръка? Да.
Здравейте, Васил Маринов, Софийски университет. Това, което чухме като критерий за оценка, не е особено изненадващо. Изненадващото обаче е, че според мен сегашния формуляр на матрицата за логическата рамка не е направен така, че да може да се отговори достатъчно конкретно и прецизно на тези критерии. Така че вероятно ще е необходима някаква допълнителна работа, за да може да се съобразим с тях и може би трябва малко да се удължи срока за проектните предложения.
Благодаря. Подкрепяте ли това предложение, защото не видях до сега? Въпреки че в очите ви чета подкрепа, ами това, което мисля да направим е до средата на другата седмица, защото влизаме вече в Великден, да изменим, надявам се за последен път, насоките за кандидатстване. Ще удължим срока за кандидатстване до 3 юни. Знам, че има много празници и в май, обаче не може да си позволиме по-дълго удължаване. Срока за кандидатстване е 3 юни. Съответно, с това удължаване ще сложиме вътре в самите насоки в раздела указания за попълване на логическата матрица този инструмент за оценка. Т.е. ние ще го приложиме. Видях, че снимате слайдовете, но той ще влезе вътре в самите насоки, така че вие да може да финализирате работата си по критериите и да си направите една самооценка. Ви предлагам, преди да подадете. Не ни се иска да увеличаваме обема на самата логическа матрица. Знам, че може да напишете много, но опитайте се максимално точно, кратко и ясно да попълните в структуриран вид. Сега, естествено, ние няма да отхвърляме проектни предложения, ако са логическата матрица е 16 страници, а не 15. Но при много дълги матрици това ще удължи и оценката. Все пак в самата логическа матрица трябва схематично и ясно и конкретно да са описани разделите. Самия контролен лист за оценка, той следва структурата на логическата матрица. Господин Тобин, заповядайте вие да вземете отношение.
Thank you. Okay, excellent question, and thank you very much for the question. Because I think what your question does is it leads us naturally into the next section of our actual presentation here today. The next section of our presentation, Dean, is Dean there? Could I get session 3, Dean? Thank you. The next session is where we're actually going to do is look at each of the variables involved in your submission. And we're going to try to marry that and, yeah.
Само преди това искам да кажа нещо във връзка с удължаването на срока. Това, че удължаваме срока, не означава, че тези от вас, които са готови, не могат да подадат по-рано. В момента, в който ние получиме първото проектно предложение, ще сформираме оценителна комисия, ще започнем оценка на самото проектно предложение. Така че този срок ви дава възможност, но в никакъв случай не е задължително да изчакате този срок. Добре, понеже виждам, че няма други въпроси, следващата има там. Нека да всеки, който иска да зададе въпрос.
Благодаря. Въпросът е към вас, към Япо и молба да направите някаква сериозна координация с НАОА. Защото аз виждам противоречия между много от целите, които бихме могли да заложим, така както чухме презентацията на доктор Тобин, с настоящите регулации. Например, искаме няколко нови бакалавърски програми. Ако професионалното направление обаче влезе в процедура на акредитация, не можем да направим нищо. Ако избързаме много и кажем, че ще направим новата програма преди да влезе акредитацията, от гледна точка на оценителите няма да сме направили нищо, защото новата програма трябва да бъде резултат от stakeholder engagement, discussion и така нататък, събиране на данни, т.е. със сигурност ще влезем в акредитация. Това е един проблем. Втори проблем, свързан с микрокредитите, които не са регулирани достатъчно добре. Трети проблем, свързан с мобилностите, които все още, дори стандартните мобилности по Еразъм не работят както трябва, защото ако студента учи нещо някъде, което не е вписано в индивидуалния, в учебния план, когато е влязал да учи, не можеш да го напишеш в това в дипломите. Тоест, сериозен риск са регулациите и ако може по някакъв начин, поне с НАОА, ако не говорим за промяна в закон, това ще улесни качественото изпълнение на проектите. Благодаря ви.
Благодаря. С НАОА имаме сътрудничество. Те участват, когато готвиме отговори на въпросите, които задавате по процедурата. Тоест, въпросите, които касаят такъв тип теми, винаги ги съгласуваме с НАОА. Днес не сме ги поканили, защото е техническа срещата, за да не отклоняваме дискусията по отношение на политика, законови промени и така нататък, но ние не може, нали, да изчакаме да се промени нещо в закона, за да финансираме тези проекти. Тоест, рисковете вие ще ги отчетете в логическите матрици, където виждате такива. Това в крайна сметка е едно планиране. Проектът е планиране с отчитане на съответните рискове, разписване на съответните допускания, така че на този етап те са включени и ще бъдат включени в хода на изпълнението. Със сигурност ще има въпроси, чието решение ще предстои в рамките на изпълнение на проектите. Със сигурност ще продължи сесията въпроси и отговори. Мисля, че до 2 седмици преди крайния срок, 3 седмици преди крайния срок, можете да задавате въпроси, така че този процес продължава. Сега в третата... Има въпроси в онлайн сесията, които ние обобщаваме. Може би след презентацията ще се опитаме да отговорим и на тях. Сега тази сесия се базира до голяма степен на логическите матрици, които вие ни изпратихте. Те бяха прегледани от Jaspers. Няма да правим посочване, нали, тази е добра, тази не е добра, а просто взимайки предвид това, което получихме, господин Тобин вече ще даде практически разяснения относно процеса на оценка по съответните критерии и, надявам се, и примери. Заповядайте.
Okay, I'm back. Thank you. this is your last 30 minutes with me, so you're okay. I'll be finished at that stage. Can I just address the question you had at the back? And it's around the vision and the future. With most calls, unfortunately, we working in the industry, in the universities, we do have ideas. And what the call might do is give you the opportunity to assess your ideas. And I think, as Ivan was saying, looking at risks and looking at mitigation of risks and assumptions, you may have a program today in your mind which you think is going to be the new gold for your university. But when you go into it, you may end up identifying you need to change it. And that kind of change facility will be and has to be part of what you do. So you need to look at your assumptions. You even need to look at your I suppose, your titles, because I've commenced programs myself at postgraduate level. So I looked at the idea of Masters in Education, Technology, Management, and Innovation. But through my research and the evidence I got through the research, we identified that it wasn't the education technology that the teachers and the leaders wanted in the post-primary, primary, and high level. What they wanted was the key skills of managing, and they needed to understand how to manage the change and the impact of technology in the work that they did, and that the people could learn the tools. But their job was as leaders and as managers to actually implement that change and to put the processes in there. So we changed the title, but the flavor, right, and the broad content was there. We just had to re-engineer it to suit the demand. So that's only one example, and I have many examples where I took the conversation with you. But so your program, it's your vision. It's your partnership vision. A question that came in while I was having coffee related to how do you manage the ICT relationship, and how do you manage the people involved in that ICT relationship? And, how do you manage the lead partner? That's a continual battle, because when you look at your leading partners and when you look at your ICT and your industry, they will all come to the table with their own biases. They will come to the table with what they believe is important. We're looking at the totality of the learning that the student gets. So at times we have to have a trade-off between what one industry partner thinks is very valid as opposed to what another industry partner comes as very valid. And that's one of the core responsibilities of program design and matching program learning outcomes, is that we as a team can actually negotiate and navigate the trade-offs. Because you might have one company who believes every graduate has this skill and should have this skill in an ICT environment, and another company who believes this. But remember, they've all got their own self-interest, yet they're all working under the area of ICT. So that becomes our negotiation, that becomes our management skill, that becomes our collaboration skill, that becomes the way we set out our MOUs and we set out our MOAs. That becomes the way we understand how we negotiate with our various partners. And that's what's important in relation to that. Okay. The second, the final session with me is we're going to take a look at the detailed content. And this detailed content is very much framed in what we have already. And you've seen so far, I've discussed your key objectives. I've mentioned grounded in evidence, and we've identified what the key areas and focus of our actions are. So everything we do from now on, we've got to have that with us. As evaluators, I want it clear, right? I want it brief, and I want it very concise. Because we have challenges in trying to map and understand and interpret everything. So we do want evidence-based. I do want to see alignment with policies. These are my principles. I want to see clear logic. I want to see measurable results in the KPIs. I want to understand that as I read it, that there's a feasible delivery and there's strong governance there. And I want to see your visions and your aspirations as to how you might turn around and actually end up making this sustainable within your organization. Because the overall logical framework that I'm looking at is I'm asking myself. Sorry, I was reading off my own slides there. I'm asking myself, does this project create meaningful, scalable, sustainable change in higher education system? And every one of you, I'd ask, before you press the button submit, ask yourselves, will the system be different because of what we're doing here now? That's our fundamental question. Will we have different programs? Will we have different ways? Will we have academics who are doing X, Y, and Z differently? Will we have different ways of ensuring we engage and support our students? Will we have different ways in where we target inclusion and access and widen the participation for the entrance into our system? Will we have different ways around assessment? Will we have different ways around producing programs? And maybe what we find is we define a program methodology which is very fast and enables us to be more agile and more flexible. So what we're going to look at is, I'm going to shut this one down. We're going to look in brief at what we would like to see in each area of the application. We're going to look at the general objectives, and you've all seen these areas. We're going to look at the participating organizations and what's important for them. Challenges. What are your challenges and what are you trying to address? We're going to look at the kind of questions we might ask around the activities and how might you discuss and disclose activities. Your target groups, who are you targeting? We're going to look at your project plan, management, financial resources. And when I say I'm going to look at them, we're going to look at them from three different, and of course, finally, not forgetting the penultimate, which is your key performance indicators. What KPIs will you have delivered to us and how are you going to monitor those KPIs? But when I look at these, I'm going to look at these in three different pieces. One, what would we like to see at a high level from the general objectives? Then I'm going to look at, for each, what might be we expect you to make reference to in each of those areas. And then finally, I'm going to look at what I want to see overall. And I'm going to do this methodology for each individual component and theme of our application. So, if we look at the general objectives, we've mentioned this morning already around this concept of alignment, around this concept of ensuring everything is evidence-based. But what we'll be hoping to see is, do the objectives clearly define what success might look like? Are the objectives strategically relevant? And if we take a look at that space, what we're saying to you is, I would like, and I expect to see in this section, references to the various EU and national documents, my evidence and skills data. I expect to understand the objectives that you have for your project and the rationale, why. I expect for you to understand what are the key performance indicators for each of your individual objectives. And I go on to see what are the activities. So really what I'm trying to see here is, I'm trying to understand and get an overall perspective on what your aims, what are your activities, what are your objectives. And I'm trying to get that generally as a kind of an oversight for me to understand better what the project is. And it's giving you the opportunity to situate your project in all of the evidence and all the priorities we already have. So in essence, I'm looking for a coherent and a well-justified, strategically aligned set of objectives. And that brings me back to clear, brief, and brilliant. I need to have it articulated clearly. I need you to be conscious of how you actually present it, because that makes my job as an evaluator an awful lot more easier. When I look at the second criteria, we look at the general question, which was around participating organizations. Who are your actual partners? What engagement have you created already with your partners? Do they have the expertise? I spoke already this morning around your employers and your stakeholders. Are they credible? Are they real partnerships? And what I mean by that is, I can go out today and I could actually meet you, you, and you, and we could create a partnership and say we have a partnership, but I could do all the work. What we want to see is, we want to see real partnership taking place. Have you thought about that? So we're asking the question there, why are these partners relevant? And does each partner add real value? Are they complementing the objectives that you've set? Are they giving us that? So specifically, what I'd like to see is, what is your structure? What is your partnership structure? Have you looked at defining your MOUs with the partners? Have you defined the governance of your partners? Have you defined your operational structure through an MOA or Memorandum of Association? Is there an effective and well-designed operational collaboration model that you've even thought about? Are there risks in relation to that? Have you looked at joint delivery? It all sounds lovely. You deliver that module, you deliver that module. But if we're working across universities, how do we do the assessment? How do we standardization of grades? How do we manage all of that? And of course, has everybody got the capacity to deliver? And we've all engaged in partnerships before, and we all know that all of the fantasies that people come up with, I can see people nodding their heads, and the fantasies are wonderful, but we want the realities. We want to make sure that the actual partnerships work. And at the very beginning of a partnership, the key is define what your objectives are and define your actual roles. And to make your logical framework better, we'd like to see you include some of that logic and some of that reference here within this section. Our key question: is the partnership credible? Is the partnership capable of delivering the project with strong added value and effective collaboration? And that's what we're trying to understand within that space. The next space is the challenges. And when we talk about challenges, we're trying to interpret as an evaluator, what are the challenges that you're seeing? And is there evidence based for your challenges in your faculty or in your area? And we hopefully will see that the challenges you have can be addressed later on through the activities and the partnerships, so we can see it all naturally evolving and working together. We're asking ourselves, is this a real proven problem or just an assumption? And this is a point this gentleman raised at the back. Sometimes we do have assumptions, and sometimes 3 or 4 collaborating partners have assumptions. But this call is giving you the opportunity to get the evidence to back it up or not. It's giving you the opportunity to understand whether the assumptions we made about a program, about an idea, are valid or not. And that's what we've got to be aware of, because you're there to create this vision which is going to deliver for the modernization of higher education. And again, we've identified, and you'll get these, a number of prompts, considerations that you might consider. Look at, is the work package necessary? Economics 101, right? Economics 101, what, how, and for whom? What are we doing it for? How are we going to do it? And who's going to get it? So is it actually worth it? Right? That's what we're asking the question. Secondly, is there a link? And is there a clear evidence? And is it supported by what you're saying and your assumptions? Have you looked at the strategic importance of these challenges? And have you identified the potential risks that might exist? And by the way, A standard risk for everybody is the risk that the partnership dissolves. A standard risk for everybody is a risk that not everybody in the partnership actually engages with you. A standard risk for everybody is that the world out there changes. Look at our political environment. Look at our social environment. Look what happened to us all because of COVID. We all had fantastic strategic plans back in 2020. What happened? March, April, we had to change them all. Everything is changing so fast. So when we look at our challenges, we're looking at recognizing this. And we'd like to see a clear, coherent alignment between your challenges that you've identified and the proposed solutions that you're putting out there. Our key question is, do the proposed challenges, and does it present a clear, well-evidenced and compelling analysis? Do we understand why it's the foundation for your project? That's my question. When we get a look at solutions, I'm interested in your institutional readiness. How capable are you of doing it? Is there innovation in your solution? I mean, look at everybody in this room, I'm sure on Zoom, we can all design programs, right? We can do that. That's our basic bread and butter, right? We want to see the innovation here. We want to see the digital technology being integrated. We want to see the assessment methodologies being integrated. We want to see the new ideas that you have been integrated, because otherwise we can all continue just to design our programs and deliver what we do. This is an opportunity to get funding to cause that change in your organizations. And we'd like to see that. So what is, and will this solution actually solve the problem? That's our question. And again, we have a number of subsidiary themes you can look at. Are you responding to the systemic challenges that you exist? And have you data which demonstrates that? What teaching, learning, and student experiences are you going to change as a result of this? Widening participation is a key aspect of this. How are you going to support the students from different backgrounds? What have you put in place to support the differing learning styles they may have? How are you going to attract students from different backgrounds? All of these need to be looked at when you talk about your solutions. What forward-looking innovations are you going to use? I mentioned earlier on the idea of AI and digital tools. How are you going to educate your academics to get a greater use of AI? What artificial intelligence policies have you got in your faculties or in your organization around policies and procedures in AI? These are the kind of solutions we'd like to see coming out from our questions. And when we look at it, what we actually see is we want to see innovative ideas. We want to see the whole concept of well-aligned solutions that might directly address the challenge you've done. We move on and we look at your activities. And this is where it starts to get easy, because you've identified your challenges, you've identified your solutions, and now every one of you knows how to design the activities involved in designing a program, short, bachelor's, or indeed a postgraduate. We all know that. That's, again, bread and butter stuff. So we're looking at, can this be realistically planned, right, over the period of time? Have you identified all of the activities that we think are important from the actual program design perspective, right? And they're your activities. Are they coherent, right? Are the resources available to do it? Have you mapped it out? So again, I've looked at the idea of feasibility. What teaching and learning and design principles are you going to look at? How are you integrating this concept of confidence-based education? How many of your academics are pushing against you when you bring competence-based education into the next meeting room and they say, no way, I'm only involved in the theoretical aspects? How am I managing that? Digitalization, digital conferences. What have we done around supporting our academics to become more digitally competent? How are we supporting them in this? Maybe that digital competence will only be supported if those are involved in this program. In my own university, we have a methodology, I call it community of practice. The academics would meet every 2 or 3 weeks, and we introduce new ideas around digital competence. Because we don't want to teach them how to do it. What we actually want to do is we want to show them the different modalities, and some will race and engage, and others won't. And there's winners and losers in all of these things. We want to look at the whole idea of stakeholder engagement. How are they engaged in your design? How are they demonstrating to us that we've got the actual program relevance? And remember, I mentioned this idea of how they negotiate and how you do the trade-offs within that. So we're basically saying that we want the activities clearly structured. And I brought back the 2 initial slides, because activities have to be grounded in our objectives, and they have to be grounded in what we call this horizontal results for our professional fields. Your activities must deliver what those objectives are seeking. We want to get short programs. We want to see bachelor's degrees. We want to see postgraduate qualifications. Target groups, who are they? And it's easy, we can all write down, we're going to get 10%, 20%, 30% of this target group. But where's the evidence? How do we know they're there? How are we going to go after those specific target groups? Why would they be interested in doing what we're doing? How are we going to support them? How is this program, if we're chasing after international students, going to be relevant to international students? Will students do one module which is relevant? When we look at our competitor analysis, have we identified and looked what other universities are delivering programs like this across Europe? How is our program or our idea complementary to other European programs? In particular, who our Erasmus partners might be, so therefore they might travel. So we've got to be strategic as to how we do this. So again, we're looking at the whole idea of capacity building. We're looking at your selection, your access. What supports do you have around supporting those learners in here? And what's the support around the idea of progression? Work-based, applied, all of that becomes relevant, because for us as the evaluators, we would like to see that your target groups are clearly defined and that they represent that inclusivity that the call calls for. It mentions various different subsectors of society that it would like involved in this. And we'd like to see the how, and might be administratively, centrally, how you manage that and get people involved. We're near the end. We have a project plan checklist, and this project plan checklist is no different to any other project plan you've ever done in your lives. It's a project plan checklist which is asking ourselves, does the timeline make sense and is it achievable? And if you even listen to what Ivan said in his very introduction here this morning, he spoke about the project plan. He spoke about milestones. He spoke about trying to achieve various targets and goals each actual year. And that's what we're looking for from a log frame perspective. We're asking, have you got the timeline? Does it make sense? And is it achievable? And again, this is where it becomes very easy. We've now got a situation where we're like, any log frame, any project plan, they're the standard criteria you'll be looking for. You're looking at scheduling realism, activity coverage, deliverables, contingency planning. You're looking at progress tracking, time alignment, because overall, when you look at any project, and what we will as evaluators look at any project, we just want to see that it's clear. We want to see that it's robust. We want to see that it actually goes across a regular timeline. And we want, as the evaluators, to be able to understand whether we think it's realistic or not. And that will be a slight subjective opinion, but we will take a perspective on all of these. Management is probably worth taking time out for yourselves. And this is really more around best practice. And when we talk about the management of the program, we recognize that there's going to be difficulties. We recognize that managing across different groups takes time, takes work, takes effort, and it takes reflection. And at times, we'd say in my country, you have to bite your lip in that meetings, right? So when we talk about this, we're saying, who is responsible for what component, and can they deliver this effectively? And when you talk about management, there's another, have you looked at dissemination? The beauty of this is that there's some dissemination process, that you plan that in, and that the management look at how they're going to disseminate the wins, the successes of the project in the future. Look at the concept of what's your management structure? What's your leadership structure? Have you looked at governance, administration? And I've mentioned it a few times this morning, institutional support. Have you got that? Because if you take an engineering and maths and physics faculty and they go off and they produce X, Y, and Z, then they present that to admissions. Admissions says, we can't put that into our timeline for the next 2 years before we actually have people coming on that program. That's not good for us. We've got to try and bring all the relevant stakeholders together to ensure that we end up getting what we want. And of course, have you got continued industry collaboration? Many times when you develop programs, you bring industry in and then you forget about them. So what mechanisms have you got to manage that continuous industry, shall we say, progression? And we've all seen our industry advisory boards, and we bring in industry advisory boards and we meet them, we take minutes and away they go. But how do we ensure real engagement with our actual industry? We come to say we want strong governance. Dissemination, I think, is very important because that's how you as managers win. If you have successful programs, if you can disseminate those via conferences, journals, papers, etc., you have now got an added value for your engagement with the project. So what's the added value to you as an individual in relation to this? And how are you going to manage that from your perspective? Because trust me, when you identify what that added value is, you're now further motivated to deliver on what the project is actually looking for. And that's key when we come to your management. The last one is financials. And again, you're all experts on financials. And when you talk about financials, really, it's the articulation. Who's responsible? Who and can they deliver this effectively? Who's going to take the ownership of it? And from your perspective, it is, can you get all the funds directed to your faculties for the project and that they don't go missing somewhere else, which we've all seen in various academic institutions. So, budget ownership, digital resources, what are they going to cost? How do you get economies of scale? Are there opportunities now for you to use some of this budget to buy in new digital interventions so you can use those to the advantage of your actual faculty? What are your work packages? How are you getting economies of scale? How are you sharing your costs? And of course, are they realistic and proportionate? And again, are the financial resources there? So what you have seen so far is I've tried to give you a structure which you can actually have beside you to give you prompts. So as you look and submit each area, ask yourselves, have I met these criteria as I submit this? Have I considered these factors? And that's what we're and our purpose of today. And finally, we look at your KPIs. And really, we're asking the question, do the KPIs, the key performance indicators, do they clearly align with the call priorities, MHE2? Are they measurable? Are they achievable? Think about it. Are they smart? And will they deliver system impact down the line? That's what we're looking at. And you know yourselves, we've got confidence-based programs. You know yourselves, we've got greater than or equal to 50% continuous assessment. You know we're looking for systems for independent student learning. There are 3 KPIs embedded in the actual program delivery mechanism. We want to see that you've clearly identified those for yourselves. Are they embedded across all the work packages? Are they identifiable? How are you going to operationalize them? Because one of the key areas we're going to see is how can you have consistency across all the partners in relation to some of these KPIs? And how do you all agree to deliver on those? And then, of course, will you collect your evidence systematically? And finally, we talk about long-term system change. Our aspiration, and this is aspirational, visionary, that what you've done will have long-term systems change. So that nearly concludes me. You're all probably saying delighted with that. Now, so no more slides or presentations from me. Everything maps onto what we want. We want to see the program expansion with competence profiles. We want to see continuous assessment. We want to see systems for independent learning. And we want to see you and all of these proposals having an impact on each of those activities there. And that's what we're looking to do. Having an impact on all of those different activities. Listen, this is not an exhaustive list, but at the top, ask yourselves a question. Think about it. Have you got the resources? Have you got the student demand? Have you got the stakeholders? Have you got the academic engagement? Have you got the interdisciplinary willingness? Have you got teaching and learning considered? Have you looked at collaboration? And when I go for a call, the first thing I try to do is I try to understand all the key elements. And then when I understand all the key elements such as this, I then break those into individual projects that I can actually try to deliver on. And again, I'm just giving you that checklist for yourselves. Our outputs, we've mentioned them. Are they clearly defined? And this is your final, shall we say, checklist for yourselves. Before you press that button, ask yourself, have you got the outputs? Is your planning realistic? Have you got coordination clear? And the reason we're given this is these are also prompts for you to engage with your partners on, to make your partners realize that we're all committing to deliver on these prompts. So you can use this going forward. You know, how are you going to monitor? This is just an idea. I did what I call a brain dump, right? This is a brain dump that I would do and I would use in my faculty. And the question is, how are you going to annually monitor what you're doing? How do you know yourself as a manager that you're actually delivering on what you set out on this call? And when I did my brain dump, it was actually here on Sunday evening. What are the number of programs? How am I engaging with industry? What are my registered students? Remember, I had to return these stats to the Irish authorities. What are my new teaching methodologies? How many competence-based models and modules have I introduced? How interdisciplinary? How many staff have engaged and how many have I trained? What employment percentage are we impacting? Where's the progression? How many people from different backgrounds have I now on my programs? So they're just standard monitoring tests that I just would do every so often as I'm looking at an annual review of what I do in my workplace. So I'm going to say thank you very much. I hope we've given you an insight. We'll take some questions. Again, you can see your key areas for actions, repeating the slide. We want to get these, shall we say, objectives met. Competence-based education, advanced digital transformation, increase attractiveness, and foster interdisciplinarity. And can I say thank you very much for listening to me? I hope I've added some value to your interpretation of how you will actually do your actual applications. And can I wish you all the very best of luck? And can I really remind you, make the applications clear, brief, right, and brilliant so that I can read them in a logical framework perspective, okay? And I'll pass you back now to Magdalena, Professor Magdalena Ivanova, for 2 seconds, who might say a few words. This is my colleague working with me on the evaluation team, the Bulgarian insight. So she's been educating me on your systems, your methodologies, and how you do things. So Magdalena, the floor is yours.
Благодаря, Майкъл. Благодаря, Иван. Аз съвсем извън протокола ще кажа, че много се радвам, че съм тук. Причините са няколко. Ще спомена само 2. Първо, в тази зала има мои приятели, които познавам повече от, не знам, 20 години, може би повече, с които сме работили по доста проекти. Второ, имам мои студенти, бивши, които вече управляват такива огромни програми. И това много ме радва. Трето, аз тръгата нямаше да я казвам, а нека да я кажа. Аз прегледах вашите, т.е. тези, които са представени матрици, логически рамки. Установих, че не, че са перфектни, ама нали знаете, няма перфектен проект, такъв перфектен документ. И има достатъчно материал да бъде поправен, да бъде понапълнен, да бъде поконкретизиран. Имам следните няколко съвсем обикновени препоръки. Логическата рамка или матрица, както я наричат, е един инструмент, който се използва не знам от колко години за писане на проекти, за оценка на проекти, за наблюдение на проекти и е универсален. Той може да се приложи и във военното дело, и в университетите, и където се сетите, навсякъде. Дошло е времето, когато ние го прилагаме вече и в тези проекти, които никак не са малки. Това са милиони евро, които вие ще трябва да управлявате, да реализирате вашите идеи. Не вашите, а на университета. Второто нещо за логическата рамка, което е изключително важно, е, че трябва да се следват наистина тези, как да кажа, индикатори, които са дадени. Господин Попов рече, че всичко ще бъде публикувано и вие ще го имате това, тези слайдове, пред вас, когато я разработвате. Не оставяйте нито една празна графа. Всичко трябва да се отговори. Не дейте да правите, как да кажа, разкази и преразкази. Много конкретно. Всяка дума, която напишете, трябва да носи тежест, защото ние ще гледаме дума по дума. Не са малко проектите, но не са и много. Всяка дума трябва да носи смисъл към това, към което вие се целите. Трето, тази рамка изглежда много сложна, матрицата, но тя не е чак толкова. В български език има много хубави въпроси, на които всеки от нас си отговоря почти всеки ден. Първо, кой, т.е. кой е водещия партньор? Кои, ако имате още партньори, гледам, че имате партньори по двама, по трима. Защо правиме този проект? Тоест, ние имаме нужда от тези програми, от това оборудване, от тези материали, наречени там teaching materials, как се казваш това? Учебни материали, учебници. И постепенно слизате надолу по граматиката. Защо? Гледате да го свържите с основната цел на програмата, на модернизация на образование, на висшето образование 2.0. Не знам защо е 2.0, ама... По-интересно. По-интересно, добре, нека да е. Втора, ето, значи има си отговор. Значи гледате да се дигитализира образованието. Пиша. Какво ще дигитализирам, точно кой предмет, точно кой факултет, точно кое професионално направление. Продължавам надолу. Как ще го направя? Тоест трябва някакви дейности, нещо трябва първа стъпка. Да събера тези, да направя онези, да напиша еди какво си и постепенно разгъвам дейностите. Все едно отивам от тук, как ще се върна, аз живея далече и от сега си мисля как ще се върна. Защото дойдох за час и половина, гледам да се върна по-рано. Как ще се върна? Кой е оптималният път, по който трябва да мина, за да ми остане време за нещо друго, освен днешния ден, освен нещо. Дейностите трябва да са свързани, да водят една след друга стъпки до качването в влизането в моята къща, във вашите цели. Много е важно да стигнете до индикаторите. Какво ще получа? Трябва да отговорите на въпроса какво. Значи ще получа 15 нови студенти, допълнителни студенти или нови програми, привличане на еди си колко. Опитайте се да го, как да се изразя, да го дадете в числа. Много ще ни улесните. Ма не само нас, ми и себе си, защото после ще трябва да го наблюдавате това, ще трябва да го оценявате. Ще иска ректора, ще иска, да не знам, научния ви съвет, ректорския съвет, министъра, всеки може да каже. Може ли да кажете какво точно се случи? И вие си вадите матричката и казвате, да, планирахме 20 студенти по тая. Значи тук ветеринарният има хубави идеи, военният, този Никола Вапцаров, много хубави неща, но ги дайте в цифри. Както каза Майкъл, той много така го представи официално. Measurable, темек измерими. Дайте ги в измерими, в числа, за да могат всички да ги разберат. Много е важно накрая в 3 изречения да пишете какво ще се случи след като проектът приключи. Свършват тия 2,5 милиона евро и какво сега? Да затвориме програмата ли? Какво да направим? Дали университета ще продължи или университетите ще продължат да работят? Как ще стане нататъка? И едно нещо, което няма да пропусна, без да ви отекчавам, това партньорство. Ние българите много обичаме така да се събираме. Много се обичаме да се събираме по празници, по манифестации, по митинги, събираме се. Но когато става дума за работа, трудно се събираме. Да викнеш долу пред блока да се съберат, да почистиме, елате да видите, в събота беше студено, ама никой не слезе. И сега като викна, елате партньори да работиме проекта, всеки вика, аз колко ще получа, що ми е тук? Аз имам моите дисциплини. Много е важно да привлечете заинтересованите си партньори. Вие вече ги имате. Ако някой ви се шикалкави, не сте длъжни да взимате. Говорете с ректора, говорете с този, който отговаря. И повече бизнес, колкото може. Видяхте тук на Майкъл в един от последните слайдове, в първата сесия, колко много фирми, компании са привлечени за партньорство с университетите в системата на образованието, висшето на Ирландия. Колкото повече, толкова повече. Нали така е казал Мечков? Значи дайте ги тия хора, не да се оплакват по телевизията. Ние тук, представителите на млекопреработвателите, нямаме това, нямаме онова. Ами добре, елате сега тук да напишеме 2 програми, 3, да обучиме 55 студента да дойдат у вас да работят. Значи, няма профсъюзите непрекъснато гърмат по всякакви медии. Не сме доволни, давате им ниски заплати, сега ще направим една стачка. Ами да дойдат сега, извикайте ги да бъдат ваши партньори, ако обичат. При това те могат да получат и хонорар за тая работа. Никой не ги иска да бъдат доброволци. Да, значи това исках да ви кажа. Нека да не се в смисъл, няма нищо. Каквото напишете, това ще оцениме в края на краищата. Но колкото по-точно пишете, толкова по-лесно ще бъде за нас и за вас. Мислете по граматиката на български език. Кой, какво, кога, защо, колко време, какво от това. Как ще го направя? Методология. Няма да измислиме сега топлата вода, в никакъв случай тя отдавна я има, така че аз наистина ви желая успех, ще бъда с колегите си, ще гледам материалите на български, ще преведеме всичко на английски, може да направим допълнителна среща с сигурно ще има още доста оценители. Готова съм да съдействам на агенцията, както и на вас, ако някой има въпроси, той Иван ще ги предаде. Благодаря ви много и желая наистина, какво да кажа, айде good luck. Баба ми се казваш, айде майка, айде на добър час, така че успех ви желая. Благодаря, Иван. Благодаря, Майкъл. Would you like to take...
I think the next session is just questions and discussion, and we'll let Ivan to manage that.
Благодаря за това представяне и тези насоки практически, които получихте. Да, аз също искам тук отново да се върна към дължината на тези логически матрици. Аз също имам опит в оценката на проекти, имам опит в писането на програми и мога да ви кажа, че тогава, когато се опитваме с много думи да обясним нещо, общо взето понякога искаме да скриеме нещо зад текста, т.е. когато не сме достатъчно уверени, се опитваме с много обяснения да все пак да залъжем малко, така да кажем, че уж сме уверени, ама искаме да го скриеме за текст. Трябва да е конкретно. В смисъл наистина конкретни неща, да си ги кажем директно. Затова и държиме тези логически матрици да са кратки. Много е важно работата с партньорите. Знам, че не е никак лесно. Не е никак лесно, когато се сформира екипа за управление на тези сложни проекти. Е важно да има подкрепата на ръководството на университета. Често ръководителите ще комуникирате с ректори, заместник ректори, декани. Необходимо е да се осигури такава подкрепа от ръководството на университета и да се съдейства, когато има риск или проблем. Затова е много важно още предварително, още в самите логически матрици, наистина да структурирате тези рискове и този ясен план график, който ще ви позволи на вас, защото мисля, че тук са екипите по проектите, а не ръководителите, но на вас ще ви позволи да си следвате това, което е заложено и е утвърдено от ръководството на университетите. Когато има проблем, можем и ние да съдействаме за такива срещи на по-високо ниво, за да се реагира своевременно. Ако не сме посочили етапните цели и рисковете, няма да може да хванеме проблема до самия край на проекта. Имали сме случаи, включително в МВО 1.0, когато се отказаха бенефициенти, защото в случая проектът беше подготвен от консултанти без ангажираността на университета и в тая връзка съм сигурен, че много от вас може би ползват консултанти, но моя апел е не аутсорсвайте или не изнасяйте изцяло работата на външни организации. Резултатите трябва да са ваши. Направете си работни групи, на работни срещи. Напълно допустимо е и ние го правим да си наемете специалист в някаква област, дали ще е в финансите или за бюджета, но не изцяло да възложите на някой да ви напише проекта и после да се чудите как да го изпълнявате. Докато видя вдигнати ръце, гора от вдигнати ръце, има тук един-два въпроса, които виждам от онлайн участниците. И единия е, могат ли да се финансират заплатите на възнагражденията на преподавателите по субсидирани програми? Мисля, че отговорът е ясен. Не. Няма как да финансираме нещо, което вече е финансирано. Тоест тази процедура финансира само допълнителните дейности, подготовката, апробирането през нови курсове, евентуално влизането на втори преподавател в интердисциплинарните курсове, но когато вече програмата е утвърдена, получена е субсидия от държавата и тя се изпълнява, вече нашата програма отстъпва. Ако имате конкретен вече специфичен казус, ще има възможност писмено, нали, да се задава. Аз мисля, че скоро отговаряхме за пореден път на един такъв въпрос. Ами заповядайте. Професор Маринов.
Взема думата, но не мога да се сдържа. Първо благодаря за презентацията и за допълнителните коментари на професор Иванова. Поне за мен има по-голяма яснота, има светлина в тунела. Обаче имам някои коментари и препоръки. Виждам известно несъответствие или най-малкото разминаване, така двусмислия се получават между тези критерии, този чеклист, който видяхме от една страна, и указанията за кандидатстване и сегашната форма на логическата матрица, и това според мен трябва внимателно да се огледа, за да се избегне. Няколко неща само ще спомена като пример. Имаше в един от слайдовете въпрос защо е избрана тази програма, върху която ще се работи. И доста време отделихме на дискутирането на този въпрос. Имаше и писмени въпроси, съответни отговори от управляващия орган. И мисля, че вече е ясно, че трябва да се адресират всички бакалавърски и магистърски програми в професионалното направление. Друго подобно нещо някъде се появи даже на повече от едно място включване така като оценъчен въпрос дали има смислена мобилност и интернационализация. Длъжни ли сме да имаме...
Отново, че професор Тобин не е разбрал въпроса. Аз може би ще го перефразирам, ще ме поправите. Вече има, нали, от доста време, ние мисля, че октомври обявихме процедурата. Преди това я разисквахме надълго и на широко с заинтересованите страни. Протече месеци наред сесия въпроси и отговори. Ние сме ги споделили на колегите от Jaspers. И вече има неща, които са уточнени. В случая, когато става въпрос за компетентностно базирани профили, те трябва да се въведат хоризонтално във всички бакалавърски и магистърски програми от съответното професионално направление. Въпросът е, няма нужда да доказваме в логическата матрица защо сме избрали конкретната бакалавърска програма, за да въведем компетентностно базирани профили. Така че ние ще се опитаме също да направим един качествен контрол от страна на експертите на агенцията, така че да не допуснем и такива коментари, но нека колегите после да вземат отношение.
Оценъчен въпрос, който може да е подвежда според мен. Има ли смислена мобилност и интернационализация? Ама казали сме, че няма задължителни дейности. В някое професионално направление може би са решили, че няма да залагат на мобилности и няма да разчитат на интернационализация. Тоест този въпрос може би не е чак толкова задължителен, бих казал. На трето място индикаторите. Performance indicators. Така както беше обяснено в презентацията, излиза, че кандидата сам трябва да дефинира такива индикатори. Докато в матрицата на логическата рамка те са предефинирани. Имаме 3 индикатора, които съответстват на трите хоризонтални приоритета. Трябва ли да правим нещо друго? Или просто да опишем дейностите, продуктите, резултатите с съответните количествени стойности. Аз поне го разбирам така, а не че специално трябва да залагаме друга система от индикатори. И последно, някои от въпросите, които ще бъдат оценявани така, както беше подсказано, всъщност мисля, че се адресират на други места в проектното предложение, а не в логическата матрица. Например, въпроса за съобразяването с хоризонталните политики, принципи, равните възможности. Също, ако не се лъжа, въпроса за устойчивостта на резултатите и така нататък. Тоест, ако гледаме само логическата матрица, може би няма да ги видим. Или трябва да ги повторим. Но въпросът е къде? Аз, примерно, не видях в логическата рамка, мисля, че няма раздел за устойчивост. Подобни несъответствия трябва да се огледат много внимателно и трябва да знаем кое да гледаме. Кои критерии спрямо кои изисквания. И ако има противоречие, кое е водещото.
Може би първо аз ще започна. Първо, да, сложно е, но ние ще се опитаме да не допуснем такова противоречие в комуникацията на оценителната комисия с кандидатите. Затова ви казах, че има двама оценители с право на глас, които могат да преценят да не се съобразят с някои от коментарите на помощник оценителите от Jaspers, поне докато не се изглади подхода. Така че това е наша работа да не го допуснем. Естествено, ако се получи такова несъответствие, както ви казах, не е нужно вие директно да препишете коментарите на Jaspers. Може да отговорите, когато смятате, че някой коментар не е релевантен. Сега матрицата, контролния лист с въпросите, той включва всички хипотетични възможности. Естествено, на някои въпроси при прегледа на логическата матрица оценителите ще отговорят с неприложимо. Да, така е. Едно проектно предложение може да е насочено само към една дейност. Примерно дигитализация и нищо друго. Обаче, ако е формулирана цел, резултати, които няма как да се постигнат само с тази дейност, естествено, че ще получите коментари или допълнете дейностите, или преформулирайте целите и резултатите. Разбирате ли? Може да сте казали там, не знам каква цел, не ми идва сега, но някаква по-обща, която трябва да има и мобилност, трябва да има и компетентност и профили и така нататък. А пък всъщност проектът с една дейност дигитализация няма как да се изпълни, ще получите коментар. Съответно, ако всичко е съответстващо, те в техните оценителни листа ще попълнят като неприложимо там, където се гледат въпроси за мобилност.
Thank you, Ivan. And I would just add to that. Thank you for the questions. Right. If you look at the presentation consisted of two components: a very high level matrix and then the more granular. We would expect that the high level matrix would give us the opportunity to have that dialogue and that discussion that you've raised there. So internationalization, that is an aspiration, yes. And we'd like to see it there, but there may be valid reasons as to why it may not happen, and we need to have those assumptions given to us. When you talk about some questions in horizontal policy, sustainabilities and outcomes in the log frame, the idea around the RAG and the red, amber and green at that high level is that it enables us to actually try to capture the totality of the actual project. Because while the questions and the granularity were given to you today as guidelines to support you in your applications, we are going to have a high level, so we say, analysis and discussion in relation to each project, and whether it's a good project, whether the work packages are relevant or not. So it's not going to be that exact science. There are going to be areas where we're going to see different considerations. There are going to be areas where we're going to hopefully identify sustainability from some other component. So that's the advice I'd say to you. That's my response to you. So I do think, given the high level, and I do think the way we've structured, we've captured all of these areas. And I do think that we will be okay to do that. Yeah.
По отношение на устойчивостта, аз мисля, че това са трите генерални индикатора, които са задължителни, така че там мисля, че всички проекти ще гарантират устойчивост, защото те са задължителни. Но нали не пречи, ако някъде, смисъл все пак, когато се създава нова програма, да се запише, както се казва, с две изречения, какво бъдеще нали, се планира за тази програма.
Колеги, дами и господа, Да, има смисъл. Значи някои от... Ние много добре познаваме. Не, всяко отча се чува. Значи ние много добре познаваме таблицата, която ви е дадена. А виждаме, че има някои от нашите изисквания, които не са така написани, но ако вие не напишете нищо, или това няма да ви елиминира, искам да кажа. Но ако можете с едно изречение да споменете, примерно, какво ще се случи, ето колегата, имаш един господин, той ма излезе, който пита дали една програма, която още не е включена в списъка с програмите, бакалавърска, или дали се съгласува с НОА. Ако това не е, ако вие въвеждате съвсем нова програма и напишете риск е да не бъде, как се казва, приета, акредитирана, значи в това няма нищо лошо. Риска е за това, за да го знаеме и ако може да го предотвратиме. А второто нещо, ако вие имате съмнение за други рискове, които по време на изпълнението ще се появят, ами с по една дума, просто ги фиксирайте, не ги описвайте подробно. Аз мисля, че Иван и агенцията ще направят, колегите, всичко възможно да се публикуват този оценителен грид, и там, както се казва, лист, и следвайте го. И ако имате някакви неуюти, се отнасяйте към вашите партньори, към вашето ръководство. Не дейте, както каза Иван, да разчитате на тези хора, които ви пишат проектите. Хората са добронамерени, но те не са вътре при вас. Благодаря, Иване.
Включен ли? Да. Добър ден. Весела Казашка, Амти, Пловдив. Имам един прагматичен въпрос. Ние сме от първата вълна консорциуми, които са си подали логическата матрица. Кога може да очакваме обратна връзка от Jaspers? Защото там вероятно ще намерим повечето отговори на въпроси, които в момента така пряко ни тързаят и касаят. И ще знаем да вървим в правилната посока. Тоест, да очакваме ли скоро становище или чеклист, не знам каква е процедурата с тези жълти, зелени и червени цветове.
Благодаря. Ами ние никога не сме предвиждали да ви дадем обратна връзка по всяка една матрица. Това, което планирахме днес, да изведем примери, и то по части от самата матрица, на добри и лоши примери. Обсъждайки с Jaspers, те прегледаха абсолютно всички от всеки една от изпратените матрици и апробираха този контролен лист върху тях. Но тук говорихме, че това няма да е... Първо, не е добре да посочваме някой, да кажем, тази логически матрица на този университет не става, не е добра. И затова решихме, че да се интегрира наученото в презентациите, които чухте. Така че не очаквайте от нас предварително да ви направим оценка на логическите матрици. И никога не сме планирали такова нещо. Тук първоначалната ни идея беше 3 примера, добър, лош и среден, да покажем, но в крайна сметка се отказахме от този вариант. Значи всички са добри. Друго нещо, оценката е така направена, това нали, го коментираме вече няколко пъти, зелено, жълто и червено. Тоест, ние ще ви споделиме, коментарите ще са агрегирани. Самата оценъчна матрица е направена така, че да помогне на оценителя да влезе вътре в същността на проекта. Тя е инструмент наистина за самооценка и оценка на логическата матрица. Самите коментари ще бъдат агрегирани на ниво раздели по логическата матрица. Тогава, когато тези по-големи раздели, които бяха посочени тук на презентацията, са зелени, ще ви дадем тази обратна връзка, но няма да очакваме нищо да променяте. Жълтите означава, че е достатъчно добро качеството. Може да има някакви въпроси, коментари, но те са само за информация, за обратна връзка. Единствено по червените ще се наложи промяна или да дадете отговор или становище.
Връзка от вас и ще знаем върху какво да работим, защото в началото казахте, че Jasper ще прегледат и втори път матриците. Ако ние не направим промяна и не знаем къде да коригираме, нали, то няма логика да има втора проверка.
Само, че това ще се случи след като подадете проектите през системата ИСУН. Тогава Jasper справят, значи нашите оценители гледат целия проект. Там административно съответствие има, знаете ли, големия контролен лист. Jasper проверяват матриците. Оценителната комисия агрегира всички коментари. Повечето от вас знаят как работиме, нали? Получавате първа комуникация. Има там нещо не е подпечатано, нали? Или не е ясно, декларация не е попълнена за конфликт на интереси, каквото се гледа. Плюс отделна част коментари по матрицата, който ние направо ще изпращаме становището на Jaspers. Там ще бъдат цветовете зелено, червено или с точки 3-2-1 оформено и ще е ясно, че вие трябва да върнете допълнения, разяснения по тази част, която е червена. Връща се това на Jaspers, допълнената логическа матрица, те правят втори преглед и дават финално становище. Тоест, ако има секция в матрицата, която е червена, тя не може да мине, докато не се коригира това. Но Jaspers нямат възможност да гледат и трети път, вече оценката остава при нас. Тоест, ние ще допуснем такива матрици, които минават поне жълто. Да се надяваме, повечето са зелени.
Благодаря. Стана вече ясно, т.е. колкото по-рано подадем проекта, толкова по-рано ще имаме обратна връзка, а именно предишния опит мен ме обърка, защото с центровете за компетентност беше малко по-различна процедурата и дори получавахме от Jasper становище, което трябваше да бъде прикачено, така че понякога опита и помага и вреди.
Да, тези от вас, които участваха в центровете за компетентност и за върхови постижения, тогава изнесохме прегледа от Jaspers преди формалната оценка на проектите. А тук, за да спестим време и за да го направим по-формалистично, включваме прегледа по време на самата оценка. Все пак изчакайте да изменим насоките за кандидатстване. Вижте контролния лист, финализирайте. Който е готов вече, има си структурирани партньорства, всичко му е ясно, нека подава, ще почнем оценката, така и за нас ще е по-добре да не ни се струпат всички. Пак казвам, ограничете се, моля ви се, до 2-3 логически матрици на проект, защото ако подадете повече, просто оценката ще отнеме много време.
Колеги, ама не само много време ще отнеме. Ако тръгнете да подавате проекти... чакай, ето, чакай. Да. Значи, прав е Иван Попов, че ако подадете повече матрици, ще трябва повече да работим, което в края на кращата си е наша работа. Но работата е там, че вие в един проект, който има 3-4 професионални направления, за тези пари дали ще може да го направите. Забележете. Значи не се бъдете реалисти. Нали? Първото нещо, което и Майкъл казва и всички, целият ни живот показва е да бъдем реалисти. Не се хващайте с всички факултети, всички направления, всички програми, всички бакалавърски, всички магистърски. Концентрирайте се. Значи, избирате, концентрирате се и почвате да отговаряте. Партньорите са важни и не бързайте да пишете 5 матрици. Никому не е нужно. Вие можете в рамките на едно направление да извършите десетки дейности. Благодаря.
Физически факултет, Софийския университет. Аз с риск да стана досаден, ще повторя от една или друга форма въпроса, който беше зададен преди малко, защото откривам противоречия в отговорите, които получавам. Първоначално беше казано, както професор Маринов подчерта, ние имаме свобода да избереме какви дейности да включиме в нашите проекти. Тъй като ние сме хората, които познаваме най-добре, подчертавам най-добре, от какво се нуждае съответното професионално направление. Това, което обаче виждаме от презентацията на Джаспър, което беше отговорено по въпроса за интернационализацията и след това беше доразяснено в изложението на господин Попов, е, че ако имаме дейност, която Джаспър иска да види, както беше казано, че искат да се види, че има интернационализация, а ние не сме включили интернационализация, там ще има червено. Нали така? Логиката е такава. От това, което вие представяте до момента. Това така ви е или не е такава в крайна сметка. Тоест имаме ли ние свободата да не включваме мобилност и интернационализация и вие нямаме по отношение на оценката на Джаспър. Благодаря.
Не е така. И аз пак ще кажа това, което казах преди малко. Вие най-добре познавате какво е състоянието в факултета, какви са нуждите, какъв ви е капацитета да изпълните проекта. Затова сме ви дали тази свобода да прецените кои дейности да изберете, така че в най-голяма степен да модернизирате факултета и професионалното направление, за което отговаряте. Само че това не означава, че ние ще ви дадем 2,5 милиона евро от Европейски социален фонд плюс, така на доверие. Вие трябва да ги защитите пред нас и пред Европейската комисия, защото Jaspers е инструментът на Европейската комисия и не случайно те са тук, включени в тази оценка. Чрез тях Европейската комисия също следи по какъв начин се харчат европейските пари. Затова искаме тези логически матрици, които вие трябва да обосновете, че сте седнали, анализирали сте проблемите си и сте предложили точно тази дейност, ако е една дейност, или точно тези 5 дейности, които отговарят и които ще допринесат в най-голяма степен да постигнете целта, която сте идентифицирали. Ако целта ви е да дигитализираме дейността на факултета по физика, да направим нова магистърска онлайн програма, защото по този начин ще привлечем чуждестранни студенти и всичко се върти около това. Дейността е само дигитализация, никой няма да изисква от вас мобилности. Ако целта ви е обаче да дигитализирате и да интернационализирате университета с повишено сътрудничество с чуждестранни партньори и така нататък, тогава тук ще има несъответствие и Jaspers ще ви кажат или целта ви е твърде широка за дейностите, които сте предвидили и трябва да предвидите мобилност, или пък ограничете целта. В смисъл, или разширете дейностите, за да отговарят на целта, или стеснете обхвата на целта, която сте си поставили. Сега стана ли ясно? Тогава Jaspers в своя контролен лист ще напишат неприложимо, ако всичко съответства. Няма да получите въобще такъв коментар по този въпрос. Цветът е върху раздела от логическата матрица. Дейности. Зелено. Една дейност, чудесно. Целта е една дигитализация и онлайн курсове. Всичко се върти около това. Всичко ви е зелено. Ако обаче има някъде на съответствие, ще получите за съответното несъответствие червено.
But it's important to remember that the totality of the project, we may have a project which comes in where there may be one categorization. Let's take the example for red. There might be 3 who are on amber, and there might be 5 on green. That might still end up as being an overall funded project. What we may ask is, we may turn around and say, could you give us some insight as to how you were going to do this activity? And you may come back to us and say, listen, in my estimation, based on the actual project, based on my assumptions, this activity is not relevant to this particular work package. And we'll have to then take your counsel and your advice on that. But there will be that iterative kind of process at the very end. And that's what we'd expect, because, you know, while you've got these glorious big checklists, we've also got to be smart. We've also got to be realistic. We've also got to be specific. So, you know, if anybody gets 100% right, fantastic. We will have our criteria, which is probably to ensure that we've got a broad outline, 50% or 55%. We still have to define that. So there is variability in there. And the second thing around internationalization, it's not just mobility of the actual students. It could be an opportunity to entice academic members of your team to get involved in the project through enabling them to go on international, should we say, conference. That's internationalization. So there's many different ways you can actually, as I would say, stitch it in or weave it in to your actual projects. So student, yes. Staff training, yes. But also conference attending is hugely important. It's engaging with other stakeholders, and maybe price that in, and maybe there's a, I don't know, you're in geography or something like that, maybe price in some geographical society that's actually having a fantastic world conference over in the Amazon, which you think everybody in Bulgaria should go, and this becomes a prize for some member of your faculty team, maybe yourself. That's the way I would look at it. Yeah.
Микрофон, защото не може да...
Онлайн участват.
От всички примери, които дадоха, звучат добре, но може да си представите, например, и друга ситуация, в която тази интернационализация в термини на интеграция на академичния състав и на настоящите студенти вече е направена и не е необходимо да я правим. И затова не сме го включили, например. Като допълнение към примерите, които вие дадохте.
Даваше думата. Ама добре, не я правете. Там, където пише, направете. Това не е приложимо за нашия проект. И тези студенти са изпратени, Еразмус там плюс работи. Какъв е... Значи няма задължително сега с всички проекти да пращаме хората непременно некъде. Вие имате Еразмус. Еразмус офисите работят, доколкото аз знам много добре. Много студенти пътуват, много преподаватели. И ако вашето направление, по което вие пишете, не може или не трябва да прати хора, не искате въобще да се занимавате, ами напишете го. Имаме студенти по Еразмус, доплатете. Аз знам, че много хора искат да бъдат платени членски вносове за получаване на разни списания, за статии платени. Направете нещо, което е свързано с припознаването на българската, на вашата катедра, на вашата дисциплина, ако можете. Това направете и го запишете. Там то ще бъде зачислено. Аз вече толкова години си мисля, че ние разбрахме мобилно само ходене на студенти и преподаватели. Значи да, така е мобилно, но има и методи, има и начини, по които можем да се представиме пред света. Направете го, ще даде малко имидж. Благодаря ти, Иван.
Благодаря. Има един въпрос онлайн, който не е, сега е логическата матрица, разпределението на райони в проекти и слабо развити. Се надявам веднъж за винаги да го уточниме. Няма да мерите по адресна регистрация студентите, нали? Това автоматично се попълва така, както е заложено и не е нужно. Други въпроси? Да, заповядайте.
Гергана Петкова, Софийски университет. Аз се признавам, че малко се обърках от всичко това, което чух днес. И това е така, защото всъщност ние имаме 3 KPI-а, които трябва задължително да постигнем. Тоест, ако залагаме дейности, които не са в пряка връзка с постигането на тези 3 категорични резултата, това изглежда нелогично. От друга страна, за постигането на тези 3 резултата, най-вероятно, поне за някои направления, каквото е 2.1 филология, дори за да постигнем само тези 3 резултата, сумата, която е заложена, тя е недостатъчна. Сега, за мен е важно да уточня един много важен въпрос. Тоест, ние от какво се ръководим? Ръководим се от постигането на тези три основни резултата, които очевидно са важни и на национално ниво, и на европейско ниво, за да се модернизира нашето образование, или се ръководим от нашите си лични преценки за това какво искаме да модернизираме, но сме длъжни, разбира се, да отчетем и тези три постижения. Благодаря ви.
Благодаря. Приемете тези три резултата като предварително условие за получаване на средствата. Тоест, без дейности, с пари, без пари, вие трябва да ги постигнете. Това е предварително условие. Оттам нататъка или ще обясните как по принцип с административни решения и мерки ще ги постигнете без пари и затова фокусирате усилия в проекта в тези нужди, цели, предизвикателства, или как пък с част от средствата ще постигнете индикатори. Тези индикатори бяха заложени от Министерството на образованието и науката, те са свързани с политиката, реформата и това са предварителни условия, които са задължителни и не подлежат на коментар, никога не са подлежали. Това е краткия отговор. Аз все пак бих ви поощрил наистина да помислите кое е важно за вашите факултети, наистина за да модернизирате преподаването, какви нови курсове трябва да направите, кои преподаватели да включите, как ще работите с тях, кои са точно дейностите, които в най-голяма степен биха ви помогнали. Доста е гъвкава, въпреки всичките тук притеснения, гъвкава е процедурата, така че мисля, че това са 2,5 милиона евро за меки мерки. Толкова пари даваме ние за, по принцип, инфраструктурните мерки. Това са меки мерки за допълнителни възнаграждения, за допълнителен труд извън 8-те часа. Според мен няма да може и да ги изхарчите.
Ivan, may I? Let me say, I have one comment and one question to you. The comment is following that you have 4 years, more or less, for implementing the project. And I understand that the KPIs, which are obligatory, is something which is reported to the European Commission, and it is a prerequisite. But when you are running a project which is 4 years long, you need some milestones, some achievements in between. Yeah? So that's why we are also expecting that you will define some KPIs in between to have an opportunity to see the progress. Yeah. So the outside KPIs, let's say, it's one thing which is obligatory, but from implementation point of view, you should define something which is happening every, let's say, half a year or every quarter to control. You should control yourself how the works are progressing. Yes, otherwise I can imagine that everything will be done at the last half a year of 2029. Yes, so which is not really recommended. And the second thing is this is my personal very interesting question to you is following. It's a question about methodics of teaching. Yes, methodics of teaching. I was an academic for some 17 years. I was professional in my area, but I was not a professional teacher, of course. Yeah? And have to admit that this was not my strongest point. And question is following, because we know that kids' perception, including students' perception, is changing. Yeah. They are not willing to read long books, something like that. Yeah. Do you plan to make some kind of professional methodics, I would say, modification, yes, or how you want to approach this issue, yeah, because this is somehow related to digitalization of all this process, yeah. not necessary, not only, I would say, not only. But anyway, this is an open question. I'm very happy to hear if you have any comments about this.
Някой би ли искал да се включи на тази провокация? Кажете от опита как подготовката.
Yes, of course. If we need a long-term change in the higher education, we cannot think that we can change only the contents of the programs we teach without changing the teachers that teach them. So one of the things we were thinking along doing the logical, whatever you call it, is that we hope to invest some of the money for the teaching of teachers. Because without that, I'm sure that all of us more or less are already sometimes behind the speed with which the new generation is changing in attitude, in habits, and so on. So yes, shortly speaking, yes.
Включително мисля, че е добра идея в партньорство с социалните партньори този тип дейност, включително отчитайки пък и новите поколения, нали, тяхното възприятие за света, защото може би трябва и преподаването да се промени спрямо идващите нови поколения. Така че може да отделите някакъв ресурс за изследвания, методологии, разработване в партньорство с бизнеса, защо не. Предвид това удължаване, за което говорим днеска, което не искам да се превърне в забавяне, защото интересът на управляващия орган да има финансово изпълнение, така че в наш интерес не е да има удължаване, но искам да ви напомня, че разходите по тази процедура са допустими от 1 януари 2024 година. Тоест, вие може още сега да започнете изпълнението, ако не сте го започнали. И след това да ни отчитате разходи. Или поне за някои от дейностите. Нали, помислете за кои. Имате възможност и конкретни въпроси да ни зададете. Това допустимо ли ще или не, на които ще ви отговорим. Става въпрос в рубриката въпроси и отговори. Но това изместване на срока за кандидатстване нека да не забавя изпълнението на проектите, защото те могат да стартират още сега.
Ли можем да правим разходи? Това ли казвате?
Това, което казах, че проектите в изпълнението вече е започнало, защото разходите са допустими от 1 януари 2024 година. Тоест, вие вече, ако сте наели там хора, които да работят по новите програми, които, нали, извършват труд и така нататък, може да предявите след това тези разходи да ви бъдат възстановени. И аз апелирам, както гледам как ме гледате, явно никой не е започнал, но може сега да започнете. За да може да имаме отчети още в самото начало. Тоест тази оценка, колкото и дълга да е, не означава, че вие не можете да започнете да си структурирате екипите и така нататък. Там, където е възможно, нали, водили сме много път разговори с различни бенефициенти, не винаги е възможно. Някъде трябва да посочите номер на договор, има някакви административни пречки, но там, където е възможно, бихте могли да отчитате разходи, извършени сега.
Професор Милева, Софийския университет. Отново съжалявам, но това действително е написано в насоките, но в условията, в които ние оперираме като университети и 1/12 от бюджета, който още нямаме, и това, което казвате, да правиме разходи, които след това да съжалявам, но може ли би все пак да се върна към това, което вие казахте, да бъдем реалисти какво можем да направим и какво не. Благодаря.
Добре, благодаря. Приемам критиката. Не знам, има ли още въпроси от онлайн? Няма. Ами, предлагам да преминем към най-приятната част, лек обяд и нетворкинг. Приготвили сме тук сепаренца, в които можете да обмените идеи, ако имате време. Благодаря ви за участието. Пожелаваме успех и сме на разположение да помагаме с каквото можем.